Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an Airbus pilot, and welcome to the virtual type rating for the Synaptic Airbus A220. We are going to fly a Swiss A220 from Geneva to Palma de Mallorca, and during this flight I'm going to explain everything that you need to know to fly the airplane just like a professional. We are departing in the early morning hours from Geneva over here, and then we will be landing in daylight over in Palma. Now let's go ahead and get right into this one, and we are going to start with a couple of basics over here, namely with a look into the electronic flight bag so that we can make sure that we're all on the same page, quite literally. So, starting over here, let's go ahead and take a seat and take a look. So, first of all, the EFB has a daylight mode and a night mode. Since it's dark, you can access them up here. I'm going to switch this over into the dark mode. Now, from there, let's move on with the settings. Now, down here, a couple of things that you want to do. So, first of all, I've got the Powerup sync enabled for the captain and the FO. This synchronizes the altimeter settings, and if you do not have this option enabled, you will always also have to set it on the other side, which for the purpose of the tutorial we're not going to do. Then we have the IRS alignment time on realistic, and that influences a couple of the procedures that we are going to carry out, so therefore for the tutorial let's keep this on realistic as well. Apart from that, going down into the third-party settings, I am using the simulator standard Lido charts, so we are not using the Navigraph charts for today's video, and then I just made sure I'm logged into Navigraph. Now, before we go into any of the procedures, just a small word of warning over here. I am recording this video with a pre-release version of the aircraft, so if the release version has some slight differences, then I do apologize for that, but there is just no way I can account for any such differences prior to the release. Now, let's go ahead and get right into this. Now, all the A220 procedures are basically done right from the checklists, except for the electrical power-up, because obviously we don't have the electronic checklist enabled yet. Now, let's go ahead and start powering the airplane up. So, the first thing is to turn the two battery switches into auto, and the batteries are located right over here. We simply turn them into the middle position. That starts the electrical power-up of the airplane, but you will see that there are no lights or stuff like that for many parts of the panel just yet, because the electrics slowly have to come on. You will see that the airplane is starting to boot, and the only thing we do by memory over here is to turn the batteries on, and then to go onto the checklist screen and down into the power on checklist. From here, we are going to go right down into doing our procedures straight out of the checklists. So, we got the ECL set on display unit number 2, and then we can tick this off. Next up, we got our 3 hydraulic pumps, 3A, 3B, and 2B. Now, those are all located on the overhead panel right over here. So let's go ahead and turn those on. All 3 of them. Then, you can see the airplane senses that automatically, and basically any item that has a full gray box is sensed automatically, and for you as pilot, that thing is not even read. You only read the ones that you actually have to interact with. So the next one for us is APU or external power as required, and for that we are going to turn on the external power that we got connected over here. With that, our airplane now comes to life, now has all its lights available and full electrical power. Now, let's go ahead and tick this one off, and with that we have completed the power on procedure. Now from there, let's just have a quick look over our aircraft lights before we move on into the pre-flight procedures. So, the airplane has several different lights available. Starting on the top of the overhead over here, you do have the dome light. That one is, quite obviously, a light that basically shines light into the entire flight deck. Then there is the entrance light, which illuminates the back part of the flight deck a little bit more, like this. in order to provide better lighting in the flight deck entrance area. Now let's go ahead and switch those back off again. Next up, we do have light controls on the overhead panel up here. These ones control the circuit breaker intake lights, so the lights that are located back here, and the same on the first officer's side. And then you also have the overhead intake lights, which basically control the backlighting of the overhead panel. Now, keeping them in the 12 o'clock position normally provides you with quite a good lighting. Then there's the annunciator lights, which you can use, as you can see here, dim and bright. And then you also have the storm light position over here, which is pretty useful, because the storm light basically simply turns the dome light to full and therefore provides you the best possible protection for your eyes for any thunderstorms and lighting that may be in the area. Now, let's return those to bright. Then we do have a reading light up here, which is the one that you see in the top over here, and you should be able to move that one around. That one illuminates the area down here so that you can read, for example, a paper flight plan better. Now, similarly, there is a reading light on the opposite side. Then we do have light controls for the displays that we're going to get back to later on. And finally, we have some more light controls down here with the main panel floodlight. You can see this one illuminates the center area here, as well as the chart clips on the side over here and over here. Now, those are the lights that we have available in the A220 cockpit. And for the purpose of the video, I'm just gonna switch the dome light on over here, and that's gonna do its job, as well as the main panel floodlights. Last but not least, you can control the backlights of the autopilot panel, the main panel, and the pedestal through the intake light switches located down here. Now, this basically concludes all the lights available in the A220 cockpit. And I'm just going to turn that floodlight off again because it just looks better this way. Now, that's our power on procedure. Let's go into the pre-flight procedure. The pre-flight procedure is executed right up next, and that one is done straight from the electronic checklist. So let's go on here, pre-flight procedure. Now it asks us, first flight of the day, yes or no. If you go for yes, all those items that have a star over here are going to be enabled. If you go for no, so basically if the plane has already flown, then you can simply click no and those items will be removed from the checklist. For us it is the first flight of the day, so let's click on yes over here. And now we are getting right into it. So let's go ahead and get started. Now we got the ice detector test. The ice detector test is performed straight from the Synaptic avionics page, so let's have a look at that. So we go on Synaptic over here, then we go to avionic, and then you got the ice detector test down here. Now click that button, and then you will see the amber ice caution message show, and when the test is done, a green done is going to show next to the ice detector test. In the preview version that I'm using to record this, that is not simulated yet, but that is going to come with a later update. That's why I'm mentioning it. Alright, so when the test is done, we can tick it off. Then we got circuit breakers checked. For that, we also go to the Synaptic page, onto the CB page, and if any breaker was popped, you would see an indication about that over here on the CB page. Now, we've checked those, so let's move on. That's rudder trim checked. In order to be able to check the rudder trim, IRS alignment needs to be complete. Once that is complete, we are going to get back to the rudder trim. So let's keep that open for now. Next up is oxygen masks checked. For that, we are going to move down here. We click press to test, ensure that we see the amber indication, and then we also click and hold the emergency switch or the test switch down here. And that is our oxygen test completed. Note that in the real world you would also test the speakers to check that the microphone in the oxygen mask works, but in flight simulation that's something you can't really do. So let's tick that off. Airplane documents on board. For this we basically check that all the technical logbook and that type of stuff is on board. Then OEB's checked. Now, operations engineering bulletins in the real world are basically deviations from the standard operating procedures. So, for example, if something in the airplane doesn't work as it should and that is found out, then you would be noticed about that in an OEB. So you basically review those. For flight simulation purposes, I would recommend to review, for example, the forum of the developer just for any known bugs so that you know what to expect from your airplane. Emergency equipment checked, that's something we can't really do in flight simulation. We would check that things like the fire extinguisher or the crash axe are on board. Then gear pins on board, again, same thing. But next up, we got the overhead panel checked. And for that one, we are going to move right into the overhead. Now, it just says overhead panel checked over here. The actual steps of what we are checking are not listed. You gotta learn those by heart. So, let's move up here to the overhead panel. We're basically starting the scan flow up here on the left-hand column, move all the way down. Then we go over the upper part of the middle column, then we go down on that side, then we go down on that side, and then we go down on the last side, and then we move down to the lights. So let's go over what we got to do with all of those switches. We're starting on the very top over here. And we make sure that the Oral 1 switch is guarded. The ProPeat switch can be turned on at this point if icing conditions exist, namely in order to heat up the probes on the outside of the airplane and remove any ice that may have formed on the pitot tubes at this point. Otherwise, leave it off. Then we got the window heat, which is all showing no lights. Then we got the primary flight control panel up here, and the PFCC switches are all guarded and no lights showing. We are moving down to the CBR panel and show that the test light is not illuminated, and then we're going to press and hold the test switch for 5 seconds. Then the test light is going to illuminate. I can't do that in the preview version over here, and this is just done on the first flight of the day. Now, moving on, we set the lights as required. Moving further down, the servant interphone switch is off, and then moving further down, we ensure that the wiper is off and the reading light is set as required. Moving further up, we got our fire panel, and on here we ensure that everything is guarded and no lights are showing. Moving further down onto the hydraulic panel, no lights showing, and all 3 hydraulic pumps are in auto, and the PTU is in auto as well. Going down to the electrical panel, again, everything is on auto, and no lights illuminate except for the external power, which can either show available if it's not connected yet, or in use if it is connected. Moving down to the terrain awareness panel, all the lights are out, the APU is set as needed. Moving further up then, we got the fuel panel where everything is set on auto and the lights are out. On the air panel, a little pilot tip that I got here is to set the cabin air 4 clicks to the right. So that's 4 clicks and 4 clicks. The cockpit controls are basically set the way that you need them, so, well, you can feel the temperature in the cockpit, so just use them as needed. Finally, going further down, the cargo switches are set to vent, all the lights are off, and the isolation valve is set to auto. The anti-ice switches are again all in auto. Moving up to the right-hand column, the ELT is armed, the cargo fire system has no illuminated light, equipment cooling inlet is switched on. Now this is something that some airlines are going to switch off in their procedure when they're leaving the airplane. So this may be off, make sure that it is showing no light respectively on, and the exhaust switch is in auto. We're moving further down to the pressurization where we got again no light and the guards are down and the manual rate button is on the 12 o'clock position. Then we get down to the emergency panel, the evacuation switch is guarded and shows no light, and the emergency lights can be armed. Then the wipers are off and the reading lights are off, or as necessary. Moving us down to the lights. So, the no PED switch basically goes in auto and can be forgotten over there. The seatbelt signs are simply set the way you need them. So, once refueling is completed, you are going to switch them on, and if refueling has not been completed yet, you are going to leave them off. The landing lights are off, the taxi light is off, and then moving to the external lights, the nav light is on, and if it's dark outside like it is now, we're also going to switch the logo light on, which basically illuminates the airline's logo on the tailplane over here. And that concludes our overhead panel, so going back down into the electronic checklist, the overhead panel is checked. Then we're moving down to the glare shield. The glare shield is that panel over here, which we're checking from the left to the right. So the display brightness can be set as needed. I do like to turn them fully up over here, as it makes them a little bit more readable in the simulator. Then the side stick button is not illuminated and guarded. Moving further down, we can already press the terrain and the traffic buttons, but that would otherwise also come up on the next items when we set up the displays. The barrel selector is set as needed, hectopascals for our flight today, and the frequencies are all set as needed. They also have a brightness controller here, which you can turn fully up if you want to. The auto-flight control panel could be set up at this point if you know things like your runway heading or the initial climb, or you can defer that to later. Then on the FO side, we are once again going to set the barrel selector to inches or hectopascals as needed, and then on this side the side stick button is guarded and not illuminated, and the display brightness can be set as needed. And with that, we have checked our glare shield. Moving down to the displays. Over here, we got a couple of things. On the primary flight display, there isn't much to do. But going on over here to the multifunction displays, that's where we can start doing a couple of things. We're going to start by calling up the map over here. So a couple of things that you want to do. If you haven't switched the terrain on yet, you basically always want to switch this on in the A220, so make sure that terrain is selected and make sure that traffic is selected. Then we can have a look at the overlay menu over here, and this allows you for two things. You can turn on the weather radar, which you don't want at this point, so leave this off. Now, next up is the vertical situation display. Completely up to the pilot whether you want to use it. This is what it looks like. It gives you some pretty useful information, so you can use it. It's really up to your discretion. On a departure out of a place like Geneva, with high mountains all around, it is a good idea to use it, so I'm going to turn it on today. Then we are moving over to the symbols. Now, lots of options available over here, so let's just get started. Nearest airport is basically the nearest airports from the FMS. Really good idea to always turn that one on. Airports is going to show you any airport that we'll find in the area. For example, you could see over here we got Sion and we got those other two. Now, that is going to show you a lot of indications. Do you need to turn that on? Not necessarily, up to you. Then got the missed approach, and that's the missed approach path from your destination airport. Always a good idea to have that on. Range to altitude selection basically shows you where you are going to reach the altitude that you have set on the flight guidance panel, and therefore is a good idea to always have on. High nav aids and low nav aids shows you nav aids, so VORs, NDBs, that type of stuff, that are either for high airspace or for the low airspace. I would normally keep those off in order not to clutter my displays, and NDBs, well, are NDBs. Then you do have the option to show high altitude airways or low altitude airways in the real plane. In the Synaptic, that is currently grayed out, so not usable. Terminal waypoints are waypoints that are, for example, over here at Tano, so basically waypoints that are associated with an airport. I would normally keep that off. And intersections are basically all kind of waypoints that you can imagine. Again, that only clutters the displays, so I would leave that off. Finally, you do have ETA, speed, and altitude. Now that is a very useful option to turn on, because if this one is not enabled, you're not going to see any altitude or speed constraints from your flight plan on the visual depiction on the nav display. So a very useful option to have on. Controlled airspace shows you the airspace structure that exists around your airport. A pretty useful thing to have when you're flying to an airport that may have uncontrolled VFR traffic nearby. Otherwise, it kind of clutters the display, so I would normally keep that off. Finally, we got special use airspace, which is things like restricted areas and so on. A useful thing to have on, but if there is too many of them nearby, you can also switch that one off. It's going to make your nav display a little bit easier to read. That's why I'm usually keeping this off. And with that, we're done on our nav display on the left side. Well, let's go over to the right side, and over here we're basically going to do the same things. VSD, terrain traffic, and then for the symbols, let's also do nearest airport, missed approaches, range selection, and speed and altitude constraints. Alright, and with that, we have configured our nav displays. But since the option is called displays overall, let's also make sure that we got the correct things displayed on every single one screen. So, a common, but not necessary, but a common setup for the displays would be to have the PFDs obviously on display unit number 1 and display unit number 4. Then you would have the map on the captain's screen over here. Then you have the ICAS on display unit number 2 as well, even if the FO is pilot flying, so that it stays in the same space for your panel scan. Then you would have the checklists or the map on display unit number 3 on the left side. So let's bring the checklist up over here. Then the map on the right hand side of display unit number 3 and the PFD on display unit number 4. Finally, going down into display unit number 5, we would have the FMS chosen on both sides. So you can bring that up pressing the FMS knob over here. Generally speaking, you can configure pretty much any display in any way you want. So you could bring the FMS up over here. You could bring the checklist up over here, the map, whatever you want. The same goes for the other multifunction display as well. So that way you can configure the displays the way you would like them. But this is kinda a recommended standard setup for the aircraft. Well, and that concludes the displays. Next up is ICAS and info. And with that, we do track the engine indication and crew alert system that we've got over here. So we analyze all the messages. Is there anything on here that's not supposed to be there? Note that on the A220, the nose steering off light is supposed to be there, because we can only turn this on after the engine start in order to prevent possible harm to the pushback crews. We also check the info screen, and that is going to be on the Synaptic page, info. Now this could show anything that may be relevant to your flight, like MEL items that the airplane has, or such things. Now, if there is something in the info and you do not have the info screen open, then you would see a small info prompt down here on the ICAS as well. So, if there is no info prompt shown over here, you don't need to go into the Synaptic page. Well, and that's the ICAS and info checked. Now, let's go on to the second part of the checklist. Next up, we got the altimeters. And for that, we are simply going to set our normal QNH, which you can get from the My Flight menu up here. If you import your flight plan from SimBrief, press refresh, and we can see we got a QNH of 1019 here in Geneva. So you can set the QNH using the selector over here. So let's set 1019, and then you also have to set that on the standby instruments. Note that at the moment, the standby instrument menu function is not implemented, therefore you're not able to switch this from hectopascals to inches at the moment. But what you can do is, if you're flying in North America and you're flying in inches, and you dial in your QNH in inches here, you can just quickly switch the barrel selector to hectopascals, then you get your hectopascals, you can dial that up over here, and that's it. Alright, and with that, the altimeters are on 1019, set and cross-checked. Then we've got the center panel, and the center panel is that one over here. So we got the integrated standby instruments, where we basically check correct attitude, correct altitude, and the correct QNH. Then we're moving down, the alternate gear extension is guarded and in the norm position, landing gear lever down, no lights shown, auto brake, RTO, nose steering off, and alternate brakes, no light, and guarded. And that's the center panel checked. Then we got the pedestal, and on here there are a couple of things that we can do. So the pedestal starts down here, and we check that in 3 rows. So we go down here, and down here. Now there isn't all that much to set up here, so let's get right down into the audio control panel. If you want to transmit on a certain radio, you select that with the upper knobs. If you want to listen to a certain radio, you select that with the lower knobs. So let's go ahead and turn up VHF 1. We also want to listen to VHF 2 and to the interphone so that we're able to hear the ground crew as well as any calls from our colleague later on. Now, if you want to hear the announcements in the cabin, that would be the PA knob. And if you want to hear the flight attendants talk to one another, then that would be the cabin knob. Now, basically we only need VHF 1, 2 and the interphone at this point. The aileron and rudder trim switches are in the middle position, the display selector is set to norm, and none of the buttons down here are selected. Moving further down, the park and brake is set. Then we can start up here, thrust levers are in idle, the engine switches are, or the left and right engine run switches, as they are correctly called, are in the off position, the engine start selector is on auto, and no light illuminated. The spoilers are retracted, the flaps agree with the actual flap position, which you can check on the ICAS over here, and in most cases that's simply going to be 0. Then, the alternate flap switch is guarded, and the printer shows us no lights. Finally, going over to the right hand side, we got the same stuff as we got on the left hand side, so VHF 1, 2 and the interphone. The lights are set as needed, and the cockpit door emergency access button is not illuminated. If a third pilot is flying along in the flight deck, for example, that may be a check captain taking a line check or something, then you could turn the audio up down here as well. In any case, you want to turn up the PAs on the third audio control panel so that the PAs get recorded on the cockpit voice recorder. Well, and that finishes our pedestal, so let's tick that one off. Then we got the side sticks. Now this one is an interesting one and something that you're not used to from other aircraft. You go to the Synaptic page and then to the flight control page. Now you will see the side stick indication up here. And you can see that little blue dot in the middle. Now that's our actual side stick position. What we do with this check is to move our side stick in the full range of movement to ensure that the signals are correctly sent from the side stick to the fly-by-wire system. So we move this fully up to the soft stop, fully forward to the soft stop, and then back to neutral. Full left, full right, and back to neutral. And this is an item that has to be carried out by both pilots. Finally, when you release the side stick, the blue dot has to return exactly into the middle position. This is also a good item to check if your joystick calibration may have any possible issues, because if it has, then you would see that that blue dot here is not going to be in the middle position. The A220 is a very sensitive aircraft on its controls, so you really want to make sure that this is in the middle position. Now, side sticks checked, and with that we just have the rudder trim open. If you haven't done that earlier, the rudder trim button is located right down here, and the rudder trim indication is over here. What we do is we hold that rudder trim switch on a side, and then you can see the rudder trim move. Then we test the other side to make sure that both sides are operative, like this, and then you can return it into the middle position where it is going to turn green again. Okay, and that's our rudder trim check complete, so let's tick this off, and with that the complete light shows, so the pre-flight checklist is completed. From here, let's go into the setup of the FMS. Before we start with the FMS itself though, let's quickly go over into the electronic flight bag. Now we have already gone into the My Flight menu and then hit Import from SimBrief, which imports your flight plan from SimBrief into the EFB. If you want to view your flight plan, you can do that down here on the View Flight Plan button. Now, for us today, we assume that the flight plan is already completely checked and we have decided on a fuel quantity, but if you want more information on how to do that, I have a separate dedicated video on how to check your flight plan and how to decide on a fuel quantity available on the channel. For us, we are just going to take standard fuel plus a couple 100 kilos today, so that I have a bit more time explaining stuff while the engines are running and burning fuel. So, Next up, we're going to go into the load sheet. Over here, we're going to press the SimBrief import button, which is going to import our fuel load, passengers, and cargo from SimBrief. Always round the fuel up. Never take the exact minimum. If you take the exact minimum and you are running on the APU, which burns fuel, then you will actually be illegal because the fuel burn from the APU is missing from your minimum fuel. So, we could round this up to 4,300. Now, since that would only be 9 kilos, I would do 4,400 for this flight if there were no threats at the destination and so on. Now, since this is a tutorial, let's do 4,700 kilos, just so that we have a little bit of margin. When you're done, select load aircraft, and that is going to update the fuel, passengers, and cargo figures and load all of that into your plane. Now, when that is done, let's go down onto the chart menu and find our departure charts, where we are going to pin the aerodrome parking chart, the aerodrome ground chart, and then we also want to go down to the SID charts, where we're going to take the runway 22 SID to the south for our Balsi departure that we are going to use on today's flight. Now, that is our initial EFB setup completed. So now that our EFB is prepared, we can go right down into the FMS. So let's get started over here. The A220 FMS is a super intuitive system. Really, a super intuitive system. Now, let's pull up our flight plan on the 2D EFB down here so that we have that available at the same time. And then let's get started with our flight's setup. So basically, we are working ourselves through the tiles at the top from the left to the right. And within each tile, we have several different tabs that we can work ourselves through. Starting on the database tile, we check that we got the correct aircraft variant. So this is a CS300 because, technically speaking, this is a Bombardier C-Series that you're sitting in. Airbus just bought the program and called it A220. So it is a CS300. We have the Pratt & Whitney 1524G engine installed. We are on the Navigraph database. You can also use the default simulators database here. And the database is currently active. Then we can move on to the position tile. Over here, there's a couple of things that we want to check. So we start going on to the IRS tile. Over here, we make sure that we've got no drift on the 3 IRSs. And we check that all 3 IRSs are ticked down here. Then we move on to the GNSS, which stands for Global Navigation Satellite System. Basically, it's what the Americans call GPS. The Russians and the Europeans have their own. So we basically make sure that both GNSS 1 and 2 receivers are selected down here. Then we move on to VOR DME, and down here we should ensure that all 3 are available. So DME updating, as well as VOR DME 1 and VOR DME 2. In the pre-release version I'm using, only VOR DME 1 is available, but you would basically want to make sure that those are selected. From there we're moving on to the flight plan tile, and this is where things start getting interesting. So you could obviously program your flight plan manually, but since you guys absolutely prefer my videos with flight plan uplinks, that's what we are going to do. So, let's go ahead and click the flight plan uplink menu. This opens the uplink menu. You have the option to either import a flight plan from SimBrief or from Microsoft Flight Simulator. We're going to go for SimBrief today, and I have entered my user ID down there. Then we're going to click Send, and you will notice that it shows complete, but nothing happens. That's because the flight plan always uplinks into the secondary flight plan. Let's open that. So you go up here onto Active, then you click Secondary, and this is the secondary flight plan. Now we go to the bottom and we click Activate Secondary, and this turns it active. Now we're going to hit Execute, and with this we've got our flight plan in the active flight plan. You cannot fly from the secondary, you always have to turn it active. Okay, then we can continue on, and we start on the flight number page up here. Now, the FCOM very clearly says, insert the ATC call sign in the flight number box. A couple of people, apparently also one real-world A220 pilot, tells you to put the standard flight number, so That's LX2162 for our flight instead of Swiss 9 Papa Whiskey in here, because that would apparently go to the in-flight entertainment system. I have an AFCOM that very clearly states to put the ATC call sign in here, so that is what we're going to do for the purpose of the video. So let's go up here, and we got Sierra Whiskey Romeo 9 Papa Whiskey. Now you can directly type from your keyboard into the FMS through a button that you can define in the EFB menu. I've assigned that to the left control button, and when I press that, you will see that circle come around the pointer. When that is active, I can type stuff with my keyboard. So we got the flight number up here now, so let's continue. Origin and destination are automatically filled from the flight plan uplink. The same applies to the cruise altitude. If this is not filled automatically, do enter it manually. Next we got the estimated time of departure, and this one is basically used in order to fill in things like the estimated time of arrival while you're on the ground. So let's go ahead and put that in, 0420, and here it is. Then we go to the departures field, and this is where we select our SID. So we're departing from Geneva's runway 22, and we got the Balzi 1 Alpha departure. So we select those over here, and when we're done with that, we click Done. Now you can nicely see your runway and sit in here, and then we're also going to do the same for the arrivals. So we are planned on the Lunik 3 Papa arrival into Palma de Mallorca. Then we are going to select the approach, which will be the ILS Zulu, runway 24 left, and we are going to select the Cap de Pera transition. If you don't know which transition to select, you can cheat by going onto the route page, legs, and then scrolling down on your colleague's side, and you can see that the arrival ends at Charlie Delta Papa down there. That's the last waypoint before the approach. So let's select the Charlie Delta Papa transition. Alright, with that selected, we can hit Done, and now we once again see that arrival in here. Next we are going to select our alternate, and that is going to be Ibiza, as we can see down here. So let's gonna put Lima Echo India Bravo into here, and then we got the alternate cruise alt, which we can see over here is flight level 110. So let's put 11,000 in here. Next, we got the winds and the weather. Now, some A220 specific flight plan formats are going to give you that type of information. I couldn't find any Simbri flight plan format that would actually do that. So let's just take it from here for the cruise, 015 at 34. So that's going to be 015/34. Let's insert that over here. And then we got the ISA deviation, which is plus 8 degrees today. So let's put that into here. When you're done on the flight plan init page, click execute, and then we can move on to the wind and temperatures, where we can simply do an uplink in order to get the detailed data for the climb, cruise, and descent. Then we're moving on to the fuel page. Over here, we are going to start by entering our flight plan data. If you want to simplify things, you can simply run over to the load sheet and take it from here. That's kind of up to you. In the real world, you would obviously not have a load sheet, not know your center of gravity at this point, so you would just enter the forecast from the flight plan for the weight and the fuel figures. But if you want to simplify stuff for your flight simulation experience, you can just do that over here now. So let's go with the zero fuel weight, 49,274. So let's enter that over here. That's 49,274. Then we can take the center of gravity, which is 28.3. Like this. The fuel planning block fuel is what we've decided we are going to carry earlier. So for us today, that's 4,700 kilograms. So let's select that over here. Then we have the taxi fuel, which we can find in the fuel section of our EFB. And it is 122 kilos on this flight. So let's enter that. Then we can enter the reserves, for which we have a 5% reserve here. And then the number of passengers, which again we can get from the load sheet. So that's 140 passengers today. Alright, so 140 going into here. Alright, when you're done on this page, select Execute. Now, once we've entered the fuel figures, we're gonna go on to the performance tile. This requires us to have the takeoff performance available and ready at hand. Now, let's go ahead and have a look into that. So, we got the EFB and the takeoff performance tab down there. Let's select that. Now, in the real world, you would obviously listen to the ATIS now and then enter all the figures from the ATIS. If you're lazy, you're just going to click Synchronize FMS, which is going to insert the departure airport and the runway heading. Then you can click Synchronize Weather, and it's just going to enter the weather that you have in the simulator as well as the weight. So that's kind of the easy way to do this. Next up, we got a couple options here that I quickly want to talk about. Packs. The 220 usually departs with the packs on. Anti-ice, as needed. Now, as needed means if you've got visible moisture and a temperature of 10 degrees Celsius or less, then you want engine anti-ice to be selected on. You can use wing and engine anti-ice, but only if you expect that you will need the wing anti-ice after liftoff below the thrust reduction altitude. Otherwise, go for engine only. Today, we have 27 degrees, so we're not going to need anti-ice. Thrust config. So on this one, you can select a specific derate function. Normally just leave it on auto, and it's going to give you a good result. Finally, for the flap settings, you can see 2, 3, and 4 are available options. 2 is the default setting, and is what's used most of the time in the A220, but if you're flying into small runways like Florence, you may want to select something higher. Now, with all of those selections made, let's hit Calculate, and that gives us our thrust and speeds up here. You do have a Send to FMS button here. In the real world, you cannot uplink this, so you have to enter it manually, so that's what we're going to do for the purpose of the tutorial. Let's move down here. We start up here, takeoff thrust. Now, the EFB calculated takeoff 2 to be the optimum thrust setting. So let's go ahead and select takeoff 2. Note that it is not allowed to use a derated takeoff and the flex temperature at the same time. Indeed, the flex temperature is something that's still getting worked on by Bombardier/Airbus in the real world. Some airlines have started using it, other airlines are still not using it. And indeed, you can see our performance calculator does not actually give us a flex temperature at this time. So in our operations, we cannot use the flex temperature at the moment. Next up, we got the wind 280 at 3, temperature 27, QNH 1019. So let's enter that up here, temperature 27, and wind 280/3. Next up, we got the climb thrust. Now, you can see there's climb, climb 1, and climb 2. Now, these settings are basically there in order to save engine life by reducing the climb thrust that the airplane is going to use. Now, this is something to think about. There is no fixed rule of what you have to select here. You can combine any takeoff thrust with any climb thrust. However, think about your departure. Today we are departing from Geneva, and you can see we got quite a couple of altitude constraints over here, and we do have quite some high mountains in the departure area as well. Therefore, it may be a good idea to use full climb thrust. If you're departing from an airport with flat lands around where climb performance isn't important, then do save some fuel by selecting a climb derate. Now, once all the performance is entered, the airplane is going to predict whether its climb path, and if it determines that it's not going to be able to meet an altitude constraint, then do select a higher climb thrust if you've initially used a derated setting. Next up, we got the APR, which is the performance reserve. Basically, if you're taking off with a fixed derate and this is armed, when the system senses that an engine is losing thrust, it's going to automatically increase thrust on the remaining engine to the next higher derate. So if we take off with takeoff 2 and the airplane and APR is armed and the airplane senses that you lose thrust on an engine, then the thrust is automatically going to increase from takeoff 2 to takeoff 1. Likewise, if you take off with takeoff 1, it's going to go to full thrust. If you're at full thrust, well, that's your problem. Next up we got the slat or flap setting. For that we are going to select what we had selected earlier, so that's going to be flaps 2. You can see that down here it automatically calculates when to retract the flaps into the particular setting. So when we selected 2, the settings for 3 and 2 vanished. If you go for 3, you are not going to get an F3 setting, and so on. Next up we got the bleed source, for which we are going to use engines. Wing anti-ice, as per the performance calculator, is off. Cowl anti-ice, again, is off. Can select those on down there. The airplane does monitor these figures down here, and if it determines a deviation, so for example, if you select cowl anti-ice off in here, but you actually select it on, then the airplane would have less thrust available under certain circumstances, and therefore you would get an ICAS alert if the configuration does not match the actual airplane configuration. So make sure that you select these down here carefully in order to avoid getting any ICAS messages during your takeoff. Next we got the departure profile. Now you've got a standard profile here which the company can define, and then you got a noise abatement departure procedure. Nowadays, noise abatement departure procedure is basically what you're always going to use. So let's talk about what we got available down there. Now, there are 2 types of noise abatement departure procedures. Noise abatement departure procedure 1 and noise abatement departure procedure 2. Which one is used is determined by the airport authority and communicated to the pilot through the company. If you're unsure what to go for, I can always recommend the website from Blackbox 711. He has a fantastic web app that I'm going to show you real quick over here. So this is what his website looks like. Then you go over here, you go onto the web app, you enter the departure airport, so for example Geneva, and then you can see down here noise abatement procedure number 1 is used in Geneva. Likewise, you always also get the engine outset down here, which is really useful stuff, which we are going to get back to in a moment. For now, let's get started down here, and we saw that noise abatement procedure 1 is used here in Geneva. So, NADP-1 has an acceleration altitude of 3,000 feet and a thrust reduction altitude of 1,500 feet. NADP-2 would have an acceleration altitude in 1,000 feet and also a thrust reduction altitude in 1,500 feet. You always enter the height in here, so that's the height above the departure aerodrome. You can see that the airplane is automatically going to convert that into an altitude over here. Now, once you're completely done with the departure page, let's click Set V-Speeds. As soon as the V-Speeds are entered, so you can see there is a failsafe built into this. So, our takeoff speeds are going to be 126, 131, 135. So let's enter 126, 131, and 135. Now, when we click Set V-Speeds, it's going to show complete, and you will start seeing those speeds on the speed scale of your primary flight display down here. From there, we're going to move on to the climb tile. Something you may have noticed is that the airplane does actually not have a cost index. So we have to enter predetermined speed strategies. Now, those would be communicated by the airline to the pilots. Unfortunately, most SimBrief profiles and SimBrief flight plans are not going to tell us what these speeds are going to look like. But when you create your flight plan for each flight in SimBrief, then you actually have some speed strategies that are used in SimBrief. Let me show that to you real quick. So, when you're in the flight selection menu down here, you can see your climb profile, you can see your descent profile, and you can see your cruise profile. And we are basically going to make sure that the data in the FMS is going to match those profiles that have been used for the flight. So for the climb, we had 275 knots and Mach 0.78 on the transition. If you want to change this, you can simply click into here and type in whatever you want to use. So for example, if we wanted to change this, we could type 275/0.74 and then it would accept that. Alternatively, I'm just going to go back to the previous setting, so 275/0.78, since that is what our SimBrief profile had been calculated with. Then we got the speed and altitude limit, and you can enter 2 of them, which is really useful. For example, in Portugal, they have defined maximum speed of 220 below 4,000, or 220 below 70 actually. So you can enter 2 of them down here, which is really useful. Lastly, we got to enter the transition altitude, which we are going to find on our departure chart. So let's go to the charts, have a look at that chart, and we can now see down here transition altitude 7,000. So let's make sure that 7,000 is entered down here for the transitional altitude. Alright, let's click execute, and that's it. Now we go over to the cruise tile, and we ensure that the cruise speed is set according to the SimReef profile. We would also enter any step climbs that we plan. However, in the version that I'm currently using, that is not implemented yet, that's why I cannot show you. And then we would also go to the descent tile to verify the descent speed that's entered down here. We're going to get back to the descent tile later on, so I'm not going to start setting all of that stuff up just yet. Lastly, let's go on to the route tile and have a look at the legs pages. Over here, we are going to verify that our flight plan equals what we've planned. Now, if you got a Navigraph subscription, you can go to the data indication over here, and then you can just select your departure over here. This only works with a Navigraph subscription. If you do not have a Navigraph subscription, you can use the Lido charts if you're on FS 2024 that are available down here in the electronic flight bag. By the way, since it's already gotten daylight, let's just select light mode down here. Alright. So, we are now going to go ahead and check that the entire route and all the constraints match what we've got in the flight plan down here. Now, if you want to cheat, you can also just pull that up over here through the data menu, and then you could get your departure chart down here. Really useful because now you got the 2 right next to one another, so we can check, okay, you go straight ahead to Papa Alpha Sierra, which is an overfly waypoint indicated by that circle around the waypoint symbol, when passing 7,000 but not before Papa Alpha Sierra, so that's the 7,000 over here. We proceed to Golf Golf 618 above flight level 100, we got 618 above flight level 100. Then we got 611, which is also above flight level 100. Actually, I'm lying to you. 618 is not in there. It's 611, which is above level 100. Then we got Rumil, which is above level 120. Then we got Golf Golf 622 above flight level 150, and that is also in there. Then we got Baven, and then we got Balzi. So we got Baven. Let's go to the next page, and then we have Balzi. Now you will notice that the airplane is going to insert a discontinuity behind the end of the SID. So there's several ways we could get rid of that. We could either just go ahead and click delete, so that delete comes up in the scratch pad and deletes the discontinuity. We could also, and that is what I would recommend, copy that waypoint down here. So watch it, I'm pressing Balzi. Now Balzi shows up in the scratch pad down here, and then we can paste that into the discontinuity. Now, the airplane offers us the different constraints available from the Balzi at the top over here, and the Balzi at the bottom, which doesn't have one. So let's go ahead and select the SID constraint for Balzi. Alright, we got that. So let's move further down. We got the same thing entering our arrival. So Lunik, copy and paste. We are of course going to accept the constraint. And then we got Cap de Pera over here. So let's once again copy that. And paste it. And we are of course going to accept the constraint as well. When that process is done, you can hit execute. And that way we have now entered the flight plan. Next we're going to enter the engine out SID. That's going to be down here on the fixed page. So we're not using the secondary flight plan for that, we are using the fixed page. So let's open that up, and you can see that we got several things that we can enter down here. The reference is the airport or the waypoint or the VOR, whatever you use. Radial crossing is going to draw a blue dotted line on the assigned radial. Distance crossing is going to draw a ring with the specified distance around the waypoint. So let's go ahead and have another look at the engine out SID from Blackbox 711. And this is what it looks like. So, engine failure, runway 22, acceleration altitude 3100, 2 DME southwest of Papa Alpha Sierra to Saper and hold. Alright, so let's go ahead and enter that. So we need Papa Alpha Sierra and Saper. So we're going to start with the fixed Papa Alpha Sierra. If there are several, it may open a window where it may ask you. So we got Papa Alpha Sierra. Then we had 2 DME, so let's enter 2 in the distance crossing. Then we can go down and enter the next waypoint, which is going to be Saper. Is that how you write it? No, it's not. It's Romeo Echo. Okay, so let's just go ahead and enter Saper that way. Alright, now we got that as well. When we're done, let's click Done. And what you've now done, when you go to the map, is that you can see we have Papa Alpha Sierra. And here's that waypoint, the fix 01. So over here, we're going to do a left-hand turn. And then we're going to fly direct to Saper, which we have defined up here. And that's how you enter the engine out SID in the Airbus A220. A little bit more like what we used to do on the Boeings, rather than what you would do on a normal Airbus. Now when you're done with your entire flight plan, you can click copy to secondary in order to transfer the active into the secondary as a backup. What's very important is that you check that the sequence auto button up here is ticked. If not, then your airplane is just going to stick to whatever waypoint it has. So when this is on, then the waypoints are going to sequence. When you overfly one, it will track to the next one. If this is not selected, it's just going to keep tracking to that same waypoint. When we're done with that, we go to the Via 2 page, and over here we got a nice overview of our entire flight plan. Let's go ahead and cross-check this one. So we start with the Balzi 1 Alpha departure towards Balzi. Then we proceed direct to Ratno, direct to Tupac, direct Matik, and we can see we got all of that nicely up here. Then we proceed direct Divco, direct Vatir. Then we got Airway November 852 towards Verso, Lima 129 Lunik, Lunik 3 Papa for an ILS Zulu 24 left with a Cap de Pera transition, and the missed approach is loaded as well. The last thing that we want to check down here is the distance to go to our destination airport, which is 455 miles. We compare that with the flight plan where it's 452. That's close enough, and that way we know that we didn't do any strange mistakes, you know, didn't accidentally insert something, a wrong waypoint or something like that. Alright, now that we got this, we're basically done with our FMS setup. Now, since the FMS is set up, let's go ahead and do the one thing that is reasonable to do straight away thereafter, and that's to go up to the autopilot panel and make our entries there. The first thing to do is to press the toga button. You can either do that on the thrust levers down here, or there is a hidden click spot on that little screw up here. I recommend to use that screw, and you can see when we press toga, then we are going to get the takeoff FMAs, and we're also going to get the rotation cue up there. Now let's move on to the autopilot panel and start setting that up. We're going to start with the speed selector and manual, and over there we're going to set the V2 speed. So let's go to Performance, Departure tab, V2 135. Let's go ahead and select 135 up here. The reason we do this is so that in case of an engine failure, we can simply transfer this from FMS that we're going to use for the normal departure, where the FMS commands the target speed. You can simply transfer this to manual, and then you have V2 as your target speed straight away. On the heading, we are going to set the runway heading, which is 223 here in Geneva. So let's go ahead and dial that one up, 223, and then we're going to set the altitude to the initial climb clearance. Now, let's see what that is here in Geneva. Flight level 090, so let's go ahead and select 90. You can see that by default this window acts in step of thousands. If you want to change it in steps of 100s, you can press the button in, and then you can change it in steps of 100s. Lastly, let's make our selections of the modes that we want to use right after takeoff. You can see by default the plane only goes in a takeoff mode, but it doesn't arm any other modes. So depending on your takeoff profile, you either want to arm heading or nav. We're going to go for nav today, and that arms FMS 1. Then we also want to use VNAV for the takeoff, so let's also arm VNAV, and you can see that this switches the takeoff FMA to VNAV takeoff, and VNAV alt and VNAV level change are going to arm automatically. And that concludes our setup of the autopilot panel up here. With that, we've basically set the entire airplane up, and we are now ready to go. Now, a quick check across the screens tells us that we could set the range over here, and we do have some messages down here, which you can clear away by going to message, and then simply clicking done. That's going to remove any message that you currently have. Obviously, analyze what you got and set it appropriately. Then we can reselect the FMS, and remember, we want performance on the pilot flying side, and then we want the legs tile on the pilot monitoring side. Alright, with that set, let's go ahead and go into the before start checklist. So, for that, we simply go down here, and we can see that the APU will be needed later on. So this is a good moment to start the APU. Likewise, if you have not filled in the load sheet information into the fuel page, you could do that at this point. Now, with all of that done, we can go ahead and start our before start checklist. So let's go right over here. That's departure briefing complete. That's the moment when you would do the departure briefing. You can view my Airbus Smarter Briefing tutorial for that if you are interested. Then APU or external power as required. For that, we're just waiting for the APU to start up over here, and as soon as it has done that, we are going to switch over to the APU generator so that we can disconnect the external power. If you want to follow the APU start, you can do that on the Synaptic and status page, and over here you can see the APU's progress. Now we have the APU on message. So let's deselect the external power, and then we are on the APU. Next up, we just got beacon and parker brake. So before we tick those, we are going to get our pushback clearance from air traffic control, and likewise we are also going to make sure that all the ground equipment is removed. So this is a good moment to ensure the ground power unit is removed and the chocks are removed, all the doors are closed. And then if you're using GSX, you can tell that thing to prepare the position for pushback and departure, which for us right now just means removing the jetway, because this is a taxi out position that we're on over here. So we can simply go straight out and then taxi off to the runway. Pretty nice. Okay, so GSX has a little bug there which causes our FMS to reset. Let's ignore that for the time being. And that also remove those messages. Okay, so let's assume that air traffic control has given us the startup clearance. So we're going to turn that beacon on, and that is a sensed item, as you can see. And then the park and brake as required. Obviously, for a pushback, you want to release it. For an engine start on stand, you are going to keep that park and brake set. So with that, we have completed the before start procedure. And now we can go straight into the engine start. Engine start on the A220 is a very, very easy thing, because it's fully automated. So, with the before start checklist completed, all you got to do is go down here, ensure that you've got APU bleed available, and the engine start switch is in the auto position, and then you simply select the engine run switch in on, and that is going to initiate the engine startup. Now, there is no fixed sequence in which you have to start the engines. So, example, if you are starting on stand and a ramp agent is connected to the headset on the right hand side, it may be a good idea to start the left engine first. However, for single engine operations, so if you want to do single engine taxi out, which is going to be a whole different topic for a different tutorial, not this one, then you always need to start the right engine first. The right engine needs to be running for single engine taxi operations. Now, the engine start does take between a minute 30 to a minute 45, 2 minutes on the A220. I'm going to talk about that later on. For now, the motoring sequence has already completed. We can see N2 is increasing further, fuel is added, the ignition comes on, EGT is increasing, and that way our engine is starting up. Now, the engine start is completed when the green start message on the top over here disappears. So let's monitor the startup of engine number 2, and as soon as that is completed, we can go ahead and start engine number 1. Small word over here. Normally, in most situations, you want to start both engines before you taxi out. The reason is that the plane needs a lot of thrust to move on a single engine, so I would recommend to go with both engines for the taxi out. Alright, we have a good start on engine number 2, so let's go ahead and start engine number 1 by moving the engine run switch into the on position. And now let's have a closer look into what happens during the engine startup. So we got N2 increasing, and it's going to stop at between 11 and 12%. And this is where the engine starts motoring. So what is it doing there? Now, you can see the fan is not really turning. All that's really happening is that the starter is turning the N2 spool. Now, modern engines like the A220's engine have very, very sensitive parts internally. If your engine has been running for a while, then it would have generated some heat. That heat is going to move to the top of the engine because warm air always moves up. Now, that means that the upper parts, so the upper fan and compressor blades, are going to have a different temperature than the fan blades and compressor blades that are located at the bottom when the engine is standing. In order to achieve the same thermal characteristics across the material of the engine, and therefore to reduce engine wear, the airplane is motoring the engine in order to bring the same temperatures across all the different parts of the engine. That's what the airplane is doing there, and that's why the engine stops with about 11 or 12% N2 and stays there for, about a minute or so. It is a bit dependent on the outside conditions as well, and only when that is completed, the engine is going to complete the start process. Now, when both engine starts are completed, we can go into the B4 taxi checklist. Now, that's going to be APU as required. Now, unless you need the APU bleed for takeoff, we are going to shut the APU off. Then we got engine anti-ice cowl, which is basically engine anti-ice, auto or on. Now, we got it on auto over here. You can see that this is not a sensed item because the airplane doesn't know which setting you are going to need, because it doesn't know whether it's wet outside. Then anti-ice wing, auto or on. And again, wing anti-ice is on auto over here. Then flaps, as required. So we're going to move the flaps to 2, which is the takeoff flap setting that we've entered on the departure tab. And then we can tick this off. Next up, flight controls, check. So let's bring up the flight controls Synaptic page and have a look at that. We're going to start with the elevators. Full up, full down, neutral. Then the ailerons, full left, full right, neutral. And finally the rudder, full left, full right, and neutral. So that's checked. Only now we got the nose wheel steering after the flight control check, so that the nose wheel doesn't move when you are checking the rudder. You turn this on, and then ICAS and info. We are once again going over all the messages we have here, and if the info light comes up down here, we are also going to check that. And that's the B4 taxi checklist completed. Before we start the taxi, let's make sure we got the taxi charts available. Now, we could either use those on the EFB down here, or if you are a Navigraph subscriber, you can go onto the data tab and then on the departure airport, select the departure airport chart. Again, this only works with Navigraph. Now, in a future update post-release, they're also going to add the live airport moving map. Just zoom down in the range selector, and then you are going to get that on the nav display. We do not have that over here, so we are just going to use the airport map down here from Navigraph. But again, all the different options are available. You simply choose the one that you want to use. Now, taxi clearance is obtained, so let's go ahead and turn on the taxi light. Then we are going to release the park and brake, and you will find that the airplane has such a high idle thrust that it is going to start moving in idle, as you can see right now. And it is going to start accelerating. Now, the real airplane can easily go up to 30 knots on idle. So we're going to apply the proper taxi technique in order to keep our brake temperatures in check. I'm going to get to that as soon as we're on the taxiway over there and can actually let the airplane accelerate for a bit. For now, let's start talking about steering. The 220 isn't a very long airplane. However, a little bit of an oversteering should still be used in order to keep the airplane nicely centered on the taxiway center line. Your goal is to always keep the center line round about in the middle of the main gears, because that way enough wingtip clearance is assured for your taxi. If you steer the flight deck over the line, then your main wheels are not going to run on an even queue on the center line. Let me show that to you. Now we're basically keeping the flight deck over the line here. And if you look at this from the outside, you can see how the plane deviates from the center line there. So you basically always want to keep the main wheels on the center line, and the nose wheel can oversteer a little bit. Now, if you're at heavier weights or high payloads, you might have used a little bit of thrust to get moving, but you only need a few percent for that. You can see I've just added 2%, and the airplane really shows a pretty strong reaction to that already. So once again, oversteering to be used. Now let's talk about taxi speeds. For turns, you don't want to go faster than 10 knots. If the surfaces are contaminated, so if you've got more than 3 millimeters of water, or if you've got snow, slush, that type of stuff, you may have to reduce the taxi speed down to 5 knots or less. Now, on long straight lines, no more than 30 knots of speed, and the airplane could very well reach those 30 knots, even with the engines in idle. The A220 is fitted with carbon brakes. Carbon brakes wear down based on the number of brake applications, not on the strength of brake applications. Therefore, control your taxi speed, let the plane accelerate up to 30 knots, and if it shows a tendency to accelerate further, do one single brake application to get back down to 10, and then let it accelerate again. That way, you minimize the brake wear of your carbon brakes. Now, the airplane is somewhat temperature sensitive, so in order to keep the brake temperatures low, you want to minimize the number of brake applications that you have to do during the taxi. So basically, control that, taxi with a sense of what you're doing, and don't just blindly move your airplane around the airport. Now, while we're taxiing out, let's move into the before takeoff checklist. This checklist is usually done while you're taxiing towards the runway and should be completed by the time that you reach the runway. So let's go ahead and have a look at what the before takeoff checklist on the 220 is really about. So you can see the engine run switches are already automatically ticked off. Next up is APU bleed. Now, if the APU is running during the takeoff, APU bleed must be selected off when the outside air temperature is at or below 15 degrees. So 15 degrees or less, APU running, make sure to select APU bleed off up there. Today, it's warmer than that and the APU is off, so the APU bleed can remain on auto. Then we got FMS set. For that, we confirm that the FMS includes any last minute changes and that the FMA is set correctly for takeoff. So we got FMS 1 because we want to use the FMS for navigation, and we got VFLC, which is flight level change controlled by VNAV, as our default mode selected over there. So FMC, or FMS, set. Next up is the trim. You will find the target trim down here on the departure tab of the performance tile. That's a nose down trim of 3.3 units. Got the trim down here, so let's select 3.3 units, nose down. Like this. So trims, set. Flaps, set. And for that we verify that 2 is selected and 2 is the actual flap setting that we want. Then we have anti-ice set. For that we just review the outside conditions that we're currently operating in. So today it's very warm, no visible moisture, so that's a pretty clear case of anti-ice auto, and with that the anti-ice is set. Auto brake as required, we want it in RTO, we have it in RTO, so that's set. ICAS and info, checked. For that we're again looking over all the indications we got up here, and if you do single engine taxi out, pay special attention to the oil temperature, which needs to be above 49 degrees. Likewise, if an info box is available down here, also have a look into that. Then we got thrust, checked. Now, for that, we verified that the thrust mode shown on the ICAS is the same one used to determine our takeoff performance. So, down here, we used takeoff 2, and we verify that takeoff 2 is selected up here. We also verify that the target N1 is within 1% of where it's of the target N1 from the takeoff performance calculation. Unfortunately, the performance calculator that Synaptic currently has in the airplane does not actually give us that value, so we just have to check that the mode is correct. Finally, runway. And over here we confirm that the correct runway, or that we're taxiing to the correct runway according to visual information. We can see runway 22, and we have planned runway 22, so that's confirmed. And cabin ready. For that we've basically told our cabin crew that they shall prepare for departure and take their seats. And that is the before takeoff checklist complete, and you can see with that all the summary for the current phase of flight is showing complete. So now we can deselect that checklist and just go to the full map on the FO side here as well. And since we have arrived at the holding point, I'm going to do the same on my side over here as well. So let's talk about the takeoff in theory, and then we're going to go into the takeoff in practice. So the A220 is an airplane that takes off a little differently from what you're used to. The auto throttle should be armed earliest when entering the runway, latest when the lineup is complete. To initiate the takeoff, you're going to push the thrust levers to about 55% N1, which is roughly on the extended EGT line, so somewhere over here. Once both engines are stabilized, you simply push the thrust levers all the way forward. With auto throttle armed, you will see that the auto throttle is going to engage in thrust mode and is going to start setting your thrust. However, it will go to an intermediate setting, somewhere about 75-78% N1-ish, and only then, when the speed is building up, it's going to advance the thrust to the actual takeoff thrust setting. Now, takeoff thrust should be set by 80 knots, and that's what auto thrust is going to do. So you will see it goes to that intermediate setting, and then as you accelerate, it will go to the takeoff thrust setting. Therefore, the call is going to be 80 knots, thrust set. From there, things are easy. You do not need to apply any forward control or any forward side stick like you would on, Airbus and Boeing aircraft. That's because the aircraft automatically applies 12 degrees nose down elevator until 80 knots. So that's done automatically, you don't need to touch the side stick for that. Reaching V1, take your hands off the thrust levers, and reaching VR, we're basically going to rotate into those rotation cues that we got on the primary flight display over there. Now, I found that in the version of the airplane that I have at the moment, those cues, while they do come up further according to the speed, they often lead you to a very high pitch. About 12.5 degrees is what you're aiming for after liftoff, and then the airplane is going to maintain its speed very nicely. So rotate into the cues, follow them, but Around about 12.5 degrees is the pitch that you're aiming for. After that, we are going to retract the landing gear with a positive rate. We can select the autopilot basically from 200 feet onwards in the climb. And for the purpose of the tutorial, we are going to do that. For guidance on the manual flying of the aircraft, refer to my manual flying tutorial that's included in the fly-by-wire explanation and fly-by-wire tutorial for the A220. Now, something that's again a little bit different on the 220 from your normal airliners is that we are not going to command all the flap retraction and all of that separately. Much rather, what we do is to command the climb sequence. So how does that work? Well, let's take a moment to talk about it. So, what you're going to do is, once the landing gear is up and when you're ready for the flap retraction, call climb sequence. The climb sequence makes the pilot monitoring retract the flaps according to schedule. And when the flaps are retracted, the pilot monitoring is automatically going to do the after takeoff checklist and will then call after takeoff checklist completed when it is actually completed. Now, flap retraction is a little different than it is in your other Airbus and Boeing aircraft as well. So, we're taking off with flaps 2. You can see we have no retraction speed for flaps 2, but what we're going to do is when we reach the F1 speed, only then we're going to retract the flaps into the 1 position. This is quite different from what you would do on typical Boeing aircraft, so don't retract the flaps too early. Only retract them from 2 to 1 when you're actually passing the F1 speed. And then retract them from 1 to 0 when we pass the F0 speed. Alright, that was a lot of theory. Let's go into the practical takeoff now. We're going to line up on Geneva's runway 22, something that's actually done by memory and that is not part of the ECL is that you are going to turn on the strobe light and you are going to turn on the landing lights as soon as you're cleared for takeoff. The strobe light when entering the runway, the landing lights once you're cleared for takeoff. Now, let's go ahead and line up on runway 22. Something I did see a couple of flight simmers do with this aircraft is to manually change the TCAS mode. Don't do that. Keep it on auto. The real plane is going to turn the TCAS on when passing about 60 knots in the acceleration in the takeoff phase. So, we are checking the approach, make sure that there is no other aircraft coming, and then we are going to line up. Note, do not follow the yellow line when you're lining up in the runway. You can see over here, that's wasting a lot of runway. That's because the yellow line is made for vacating the runway, not for lining up on it.
On runway 22.
Alright, we're lined up, auto throttle on, and then we're ready to go. So, let's press the chrono button, advance the thrust levers to 55%, no forward stick, that's done automatically. And with the engine stabilized, simply push the thrust levers forward. You can see thrust mode comes on, and you can see the engines initially run to about 77% here, and now as we accelerate, you will notice them run further up to the intended takeoff setting. And here it is, by 60 knots. 80 knots, thrust set. Hands off thrust levers, passing VR, very light backstick, the plane rotates really easily. Follow the rotation cue, but only give it about, 12.5, 15 degrees of pitch to maintain the speed. Positive climb, gear up. So we can see FMS navigation has come on, and we can engage the autopilot. So, with that, we're up and climbing. A quick look down here. You can see we do not have a conventional crossbar flight director. Instead, we got the flight director that's kind of similar to the bird view on other Airbus aircraft. As we're passing 1,500 above ground, the engines are going to go into climb thrust. And since we selected noise abatement departure procedure 2, we are going to start the acceleration when we're in 3000 AGL, which equals 4500 feet on the barometric altimeter. Well, with that, we're on our initial climb, and we can just about take a moment here to enjoy the fantastic views before we are reaching 4500 feet and then start the acceleration sequence. So with the speed selector on FMS and VNAV selected, you can see VFLC, VNAV flight level change is coming on, and the target speed is going up for the acceleration. Remember, we only retract the flaps once we reach the F1 speed by commanding the climb sequence. So we're accelerating, we're accelerating, we're accelerating. And here we go, passing F1, so we command climb sequence, retract the flaps from 2 to 1, and now, without any further additional command, the pilot monitoring is going to retract the flaps when passing the F0 speed. So here we are at F0. Let's retract those flaps. Then we can open the ECL and go for the after takeoff checklist. The only thing you've got to select over there is the ICAS, and that is a silent item. So you'll simply check that everything is looking normal over there, take it off, and call after takeoff checklist complete. Alright, and then we can close the ECL again. Now, ATC has just cleared us for further climb, all the way up to the cruise level of 370, so let's select that up there. During the climb, you will occasionally see the speed window open and show us a speed. That's because the minimum speed you can select is going to increase depending on the G-loading that's going on. Now we're passing 7,000, and remember the SID had a 7,000 foot restriction for the turn, so we start the turn, and that is also the transition altitude. So let's push to set standard and do the same down here, and standard is cross-checked, and we are continuing the climb. So the airplane's FMS mode is going to take us along our route now. The vertical situation display nicely shows us that we are proceeding above all the constraints and that there is no limiting terrain along our route. With that, we can go over into the climb, well, phase of flight. I don't want to call it the climb sequence here, but you know what I mean. So, below 10,000 feet, the speed is maintained at 250, and we do keep sterile cockpits, so no unnecessary talks or anything the likes. So at this point, we'd just be sitting here, not talking, not doing anything except flying the airplane, which may include things like matching the heading bug by pressing the push to synchronize button over here, stuff like that. Now, we're passing flight level 100. The airplane automatically starts the acceleration towards the climb speed that we have commanded over here on the climb tab. And passing level 100, we are going to turn off the logo light if it was on, the taxi light, as well as the landing lights. If it is smooth outside, and today it absolutely is, as you can easily feel, we can also switch the seatbelt sign from on into auto, and that's going to turn the fasten seatbelt sign off. We do look down here at the pressurization. At 10,000 we're normally going to have approximately a differential pressure of 2.4. We make sure that we're meeting all the altitude constraints, and like that our airplane is now climbing. Now, if you have a problem meeting any of those altitude constraints, you can always increase the climb thrust if you are using a D-rated climb. How do you do that? Let's have a look down here. You do have the thrust button available on pretty much any page. So even if we went to the legs page, thrust is always down there. So you can go to thrust, and over here you can select between the different climb thrust settings. You can nicely see that right now climb gives us 92% and 1, climb 1 gives us 90, climb 2 gives us 88. If you see that you're not able to meet any altitude constraint, then you can at any time increase it from any of the D rates to the full climb thrust. only if required. It can go to maximum continuous, which is going to give you a little further climb. But going to max continuous is going to cause the engine to get hotter than it would normally in the climb thrust regime, which is going to increase the cost because of increased maintenance. The airplane is completely tracking that live and is going to give you feedback. So right now, we're pretty much in a situation where we are just about meeting that Golf 622 constraint. So what can you do if it would turn out that we're not able to meet it? Well, you will find that on the climb tab, there are two different speeds that are available to you. That's the maximum angle and the maximum rate speed. So maximum angle results in the greatest angle of climb above the ground. So if you have a situation where we're not able to meet, for example, that Balzi level 200 restriction down there, then going to the maximum angle speed is going to result in the greatest angle over the ground, so the greatest altitude gained over a certain distance for your airplane. Now on the other hand side, if air traffic control tells you to expedite the climb, then you've got the maximum rate speed available down there. So for that, you would simply set the maximum rate speed, so for example that's 211 knots, then you go to manual speed control, and then the airplane is going to target that speed, giving you the best possible rate of climb. So those are some really nice features that you've got available down here on the climb tab of the performance tile of the FMS. Again, really useful stuff. Now, it's summer, we're climbing, and even though it's been 27 degrees down at our departure airport, the temperatures are decreasing as we're climbing to higher altitudes. With that may come the need for anti-ice. So, let's talk about it. When do we need anti-ice? Do we need to do anything with anti-ice at all in this aircraft? Well, two things. So, let's start with the cowl anti-ice. Now, cowl anti-ice is the word used by Bombardier for a long time and effectively means engine anti-ice. Why do they call it cowl anti-ice? Let's have a very quick look. So, engine anti-ice does not anti-ice the entire engine, like the name would suggest. Much rather, and you can nicely see that when you look at the engine, only the front of the cowling is getting de-iced. So the fan blades are not de-iced. The core of the engine is not de-iced. Only the cowling, so the inlet of the cowling, is anti-iced. You can nicely see that looking at the airplane as well. That's a different material up here than it is back here. That's because this is the material that's going to heat up. Why is it done that way? Because if ice accumulates up here on the front and then breaks off, pieces of ice could fall into the fan blades and that could cause damage to your airplane. You don't want that damage to the fan blade, of course. That's why you have the cowl anti-ice. Now, anti-ice in the A220 is fully automated. You can see you got auto, auto, auto. So, that means you do not need to make any manual selections. But if automatic anti-ice goes inoperative for whatever reasons, you may be required to turn it on manually. When would you do that? Well, if the temperature is 10 degrees Celsius or less, and visible moisture, which in the air basically means clouds or rain or snow, is present, then you would turn the anti-ice on. Normally, not required because the system is fully automated. You do have ice detection probes on the airplane up here and up here. The way that those work is that when you have a little vibrator in there. If ice forms on that vibrating device, the vibration is going to change and slow down. When that happens, the airplane is going to electrically heat up the element in order to melt the ice. When that is done, turns that heater off again. That way you kind of get a continuous cycle of the ice detection probe icing up, aka changing its frequency in which it vibrates and getting freed again. When a certain number of cycles are reached, the airplane is going to turn on the engine anti-ice. When those cycles continue, then at some point the airplane will determine that a lot of ice is building up, and then it's going to turn on the wing anti-ice. Now, wing anti-ice is something we need to talk about because the A220 is a little special when it comes to wing anti-ice. Now, when you go into the checklists, you will notice that there is a high altitude climb track available for when you are climbing above flight level 350. Now this check needs to be done before reaching flight level 350. How is that done? So if we go into here, we can see it commands the anti-ice wing off. And then it tells you to avoid icing conditions. Now why is that important? The 220 has some issues where if at high levels the wing anti-ice could come on, the cowlings could heat up as well. And when the wing anti-ice is on for a very long time and the cowlings are heating up, that could eventually cause the temperatures of the fire detectors in the engines to exceed a certain limit, and then could cause an engine fire warning if you do not turn the wing anti-ice off above flight level 350. So that's the background of why this is done. This check should be done as soon as no more icing conditions are anticipated. Now we just talked about icing conditions being temperatures of 10 degrees or less with visible moisture present. And that is true, but it's 10 degrees true air temperature or less. When the static air temperature falls below a temperature of minus 40 degrees, then any water that might be in clouds is going to be so deeply frozen that that ice is simply going to bounce off the airplane, and therefore ice can no longer build up. That means that if visible moisture is present, so if we were flying through clouds, we would run this check as soon as the SAT falls below minus 40 degrees. If there is no visible moisture present, then you can actually do this check as early as is convenient. However, there is one more item when it comes to the wing anti-ice in the C series, respectively the A220. And that is, on the first flight of the day, we have to conduct a wing anti-ice test. Now, that test is done because the airplane can exhibit some rather bad flying characteristics if the wings are icing up. So, at any point in the climb where it is convenient, we are going to go ahead and turn the wing anti-ice on manually. Now, we want to see this run continuously without generating a failure message for 3 minutes. So take a good look at the timer down there. We're at 0454 basically, so by the time we reach 0457, we can turn the wing anti-ice back off again. This is only done on the first flight of the day. On consecutive flights, you no longer need to run this test. Alright, so now we're climbing. We are running the anti-ice tests in the background. Let's talk a little bit more about the autopilot modes that are available for us for the climb. So in general, the preferred mode is going to be flight level change. This is the default mode that will basically be used for the climb at all time, unless a reduction of the vertical speed becomes necessary. Now, in flight level change, the airplane sets the maximum climb thrust that's determined by the electronic engine controls, and then it is going to pitch the airplane in order to follow the target speed that's commanded. Now, this is a fairly simple system. To make it a little bit more complex, we can now add VNAV to that flight level change. When we do that, VNAV is going to add a layer of protection. In that, VNAV is going to level off at any altitude constraints that we may have. So, let's assume theoretically that Redno over here would have an altitude constraint at flight level 290. If we assume that theoretical constraint, then we would get an amber 29,000 shown next to the manually selected altitude. If we had that amber, I'm saying amber, I mean magenta, if we had that magenta 29,000 and VNAV is active, so we have VFLC instead of FLC, then the airplane would level off at that altitude or at that constraint and only continue the climb after passing the constraint. Now, let's imagine a situation where that could be the case. So, take for example the British Isles. Pretty much any of those airports, especially London, has a lot of those 6,000 feet constraints on the departure. If you're departing in VNAV, or if you're departing with level change and VNAV selected, the airplane is going to level off at those constraints. When ATC clears you above those constraints, you could simply select, or you could simply delete all of those constraints from the legs page, which does take a lot of time, or you simply deselect VNAV and make the airplane climb in a standard FLC, so in a standard level change mode. Those are the two options that you've got available for VNAV in the climb. Likewise, the same can be done in vertical speed. So, when would you go to vertical speed then? So we just said level change always gives you maximum thrust in the climb, minimum thrust in the descent, and then pitches to maintain the speed. But if we're approaching our cleared altitude and have an excessively high vertical speed, then we want to reduce that in order to avoid any nonsense TCAS alerts. What do I mean with that? Well, TCAS causes a traffic advisory, so traffic, when you're 40 seconds from a potential collision with another aircraft. Imagine you're after takeoff, you're climbing at 3,000 feet a minute to an altitude, and 1,000 feet above that altitude is going to be another aircraft. You're totally separated from an ATC point of view, but when you climb at 3,000 feet a minute and approach your cleared altitude at 3,000 feet a minute, that would mean with 3,000 feet a minute, 1,000 feet below the other aircraft, you would only have 20 seconds until a potential impact. TCAS does not care about your autopilot mode selections, whatever. It just looks at the rated closure and gives you the alerts accordingly. Therefore, with a higher rated climb, you may get a TCAS alert when you are approaching your cleared altitude at an excessive vertical speed. Therefore, with 3,000 feet to go to your cleared altitude, you shouldn't climb faster than 3,000 feet a minute. If level change gives you more than 3,000 feet a minute, go vertical speed and reduce it. How you do that? Quite simple. Select vertical speed, dial in whatever you need, and that's it. Let's go back to level change for our flight here. Now, when you got 3,000 feet to go, maximum 3,000 feet a minute. 2,000 feet to go, maximum 2,000 feet a minute. 1,000 feet to go, maximum 1,000 feet a minute. And here comes the big difference between the A220 and any of your Boeing or Airbus aircraft. In any Boeing or Airbus, you're either in VNAV, respectively managed climb, managed descent for other Airbuses, you're either in VNAV, and then you have the protections for the altitude and everything else, or you're not. In the A220, VNAV can be active with vertical speed mode. Let's have a look at that. Let's go vertical speed here. You can see VNAV is still active, and now let's have a look at the FMAs. So we now see, instead of the normal vertical speed, we get V vertical speed. So now VNAV is still protecting us from busting altitude constraints, so it is going to level off at any constraint where it has to level off, even though vertical speed mode has been used. That's something that you don't have on other aircraft. Really useful stuff. Now, flight path angle mode is also available, but there is no reason to use that in the climb. I really can't think of any, so let's just ignore that mode for the climb. So, default mode for the climb, level change with VNAV engaged. VNAV can be removed if you can ignore constraints. And finally, vertical speed mode can be used when you have to reduce the rated climb. Alright, now the 3 minutes for the wing anti-ice test are over, so we can switch the wing anti-ice back on auto. And since we're now climbing to a higher altitude, let's go ahead and run the high altitude climb checks. So, anti-ice, wing off, off, and avoid icing conditions. And that's the high altitude climb checks complete. Now, if for whatever reason you're not able to avoid icing conditions above flight level 350, you cannot climb above 350. So, let's say for example, we're flying in the polar regions, and the temperature at cruise level is minus 38 degrees, where icing can occur, and we have a layer of clouds above level 350, we cannot climb to those levels. We must stay at level 350 or below. So that's something very important to keep in mind for your A220. Very important. If the SAT is not at or below minus 40 degrees, you must not climb above level 350. Now, under the vast majority of conditions, that's not really going to play any role, because you can see it over here. We're at minus 42 degrees at level 330. Basically at 320 we were right on the transition. And right now the temperature is even a little bit warmer than the standard atmosphere. So under most conditions, level 350 you would have, under the ICAO standard atmosphere, about minus 54 degrees. So a lot of margin. So that you would, in most situations, not be limited by that wing anti-ice constraint. But it is there, it does exist, and it is important for the pilot to know that it exists. And likewise, it is important that you always carry out the high altitude climb check. Remember, if you forget to do that, you can get faulty engine fire warnings. So that's something that you would probably agree is rather important. Alright, now that much about the anti-ice and everything that goes into this. You can see that as we're reaching the transition from indicated airspeed to the Mach number, the airplane does convert automatically, and it is now following the Mach 0.78 that we have selected down here on the climb tile. A small word here on the Mach number. The sim brief profile for the airplane basically only has 275/0.78. That is a pretty high speed to fly for an A220. And you can see that even with full climb thrust, only getting about 700 feet a minute in the climb over here. Generally, you can see that the climb does take a long time in this airplane. Now, if you reduce that speed, say for example Mach 0.74 instead of 7.8, you are going to get quite the better climb out of your airplane. That's just something to keep in mind as you're flying along in the A220. Now, that's pretty much most of the stuff that we would care about during a normal climb out. As we are slowly approaching cruise altitude, let's go ahead and talk about a couple of the things that we would have to do in cruise, that pilots typically do in cruise, and you know, what a realistic flight deck would look like during cruise operations. Now, number one, close the substage. Believe me, just close them. And if you don't have substrates in your aircraft because you're a poor Boeing 737 pilot, then put a checklist into the windows. Just something. Because the sun is incredibly blinding up here at cruise levels. We do also have a substrate over here, which by pure coincidence, I'm sure it is just coincidence, exactly fits the front windows. Again, pretty useful stuff over here. So that is kind of what the flight deck would look like in 99% of the cases. And let's admit it, it's nice. It's very nice if you can put your sunglasses off, if you can take your sunglasses off, and don't have to sit there with sunglasses on for the entire time. Now, obviously, in cruise, we would be wearing noise-cancelling headphones. And we do actually have an option for that. So, if you go into the settings, and then onto the audio settings, you can see a noise cancellation sound set is available there. And honestly, this is much, much closer to what a real pilot would hear in an A220 than the standard sound set that flight simmers would be using most of the time. It kind of makes sense, because flight simmers are used to hearing aircraft from the cabin, and they're often not wearing noise-cancelling headsets in the cabin. Some do, to listen to music and that kind of stuff. But in the flight deck, you're basically always wearing those. The 220 isn't a very loud aircraft, but nonetheless, protect your ears, don't fall for it. Just take it nice and easy. So in the last 1000 feet for the climb, we are supposed to maintain sterile cockpit. Obviously for the tutorial I'm not gonna shut up talking for a minute and a half, as we're climbing at about 600-700 feet a minute. But you get the idea there. Now while we're cruising along, let's talk about a couple of things. First of all, there's the chronometer. Now, unfortunately, this one only goes to 99 minutes and thereafter resets to 0. So technically speaking, there is no great use for the chrono. However, the airplane does have quite some other features available. Now let's talk about fuel checks. Pilots are required to conduct fuel checks on a regular basis. On the long haul, we do them latest once an hour. On the short haul, many companies will demand fuel checks to be carried out at least once every 30 minutes. The top of climb is usually a very good point in time to carry out the first fuel check. So let's go right down into the OFP, scroll down to our nav log and have a look. So here's the top of climb, 21 minutes. We are taking quite a bit longer than that, and we need a minimum of 2.8 tons of fuel on board. So looking over here, we are just reaching the top of climb now. We can see VNAV, altitude capture, and here we are. We did take 28 minutes to get up here. I think the SimBrief profile just isn't quite accurate, because the time like 28 minutes to cruise level does sound absolutely believable. And we have 3 tons of fuel on board, compared to the minimum of 2.8 determined by the flight plan. Now, that's quite the good figure. Because remember, we did take additional fuel down on the ground. Now, we're overflying Matic VOR, and it is always a good idea to do one more fuel check when you are actually overflying a station. That's because the top of climb can vary by the time, and therefore the fuel can of course change. If you take an additional 7 minutes to get to the top of climb, then obviously you may have burned more fuel. So when overflying a station, it's always a good idea to conduct a fuel check as well. So let's go to route and flight log. This is a really useful page. Now look at that. Over here, it logs exactly what we had when overflying all those waypoints. So, we have the takeoff time down here. We took off at 4:40. We got all the waypoints from the set, all the way to the last waypoint we've overflown, which is Matic VOR. Now, we do also have the fuel over here, 2,970 kilos. We have the actual time overhead. So, with all of that information, you can very easily compare to the flight plan. Matic 2.7 minimum, we had 2,970. Alright, fantastic. That's your fuel check done. Now you know that the fuel check has been carried out exactly. Wonderful. Okay, so that's the flight log. Now, apart from that, you're really just flying along, and that's it. It's a very easy airplane, highly automated, not a lot of things to do. You do your regular fuel checks, you do pay attention to what's going on. If you are a very strict company, you may be required to insert any boundaries between airspaces on your fix page. So for example, Vatir is the boundary between Marseille and Barcelona control. So what you could do in order to visualize that is to go down to the fix page, then enter Vatir down here, done, and now you have that thing visually marked on your nav display so that you know, I'm expecting something to happen by the time that I reach this waypoint. That's some really cool stuff there that, you know, I would certainly recommend flight simulators to do. Makes it a little bit easier. Of course, you may still have frequency changes before reaching the sector boundary, but especially when you're flying in VATSIM, you know, this helps to mitigate against lost comms. So, pretty useful stuff. Apart from that, if you need to fly direct to a waypoint, let's say ATC wants us to proceed direct to Vatir, there's several ways you can do this. You can select it over here. Simply go onto the waypoint, hit direct, that's it. Now, we're going to use another couple of methods. So let's say we are supposed to fly direct to Verso now. You can also click on the waypoint over here, and then you have the same menu that you just had on the nav display as well. Again, useful stuff. Or, if you don't want to fiddle with all that kind of stuff, you simply hit the direct button down here, you select the waypoint, so let's say we want to fly direct to Verso, select that, execute, and you can see, once that's executed, the plane is simply taking us there. Easy stuff. You still have the waypoint, or you still have the marked waypoint from the fixed page in here, of course, because those are independent, and that's it. Now, one last thing that's good to know here is the offset function. With that, you can fly left or right offsets from your route. For example, in many countries in Africa, you are going to offset 1 or 2 miles to the right of your route. When flying across the North Atlantic, remember, this airplane can fly for up to 8 hours. You could do transatlantic crossings with it. Then you would also use offsets. So, lots of things that you can do there that are pretty nice to have, that you've got available down here on the legs page. Finally, on the cruise tab of the performance tile, you do have your cruise altitude, your optimum and your maximum altitudes. And in the real world, you would also have constant speed cruise, where you can change the Mach number, you have step climbs, which you can use to predict an optimum step point. Unfortunately, at this point in time, those things are not implemented in the Synaptic A220. I do hope that a lot of them are going to be added post-release, but for now, that's what we got. So, let's say you're flying a longer flight and you have to execute step climbs anyway. What can you do about it? Well, make your life simple. As soon as the optimum altitude goes up to the expected next altitude, go up here, put the altitude up, hit level change, climb up to the new altitude. Now, you do have to update them in the init page of the flight plan manually. That does not happen automatically, but that's kind of what you can do with the release version of the Synaptic A220. Again, not perfect stuff, but it gets you where you want to go. At the end of the day, that's what counts. Now, the top of descent point is slowly coming in. Now, I would recommend, especially when you're new to an airplane, when you're not too used to it, start your descent preparations, 120 to 150 miles out. That way, you have enough time available for your descent preparation. So let's go ahead and get started with it. And the first thing, as always, is to get the weather. If you're flying online, get the ATIS. If you're flying offline, you can always update the destination weather down here on the flight plan page. And we can see Palma gives us wind 220 at 4, 28 degrees, and a QNH of 1017. So, with that wind, it's pretty obvious we are going to fly into runway 24 today. Now, Palma, standard landing runway 24 left. So let's start setting up our EFB. The first thing is we need the charts. So we need the parking chart, and we need the ground chart, and we are landing in a westerly configuration today. Then we need our standard arrival routes, and we have a couple charts available here. We do have RNAV stars, and we do have conventional stars. Oh, we are going to use the conventional ones today, so let's go ahead and pin that one. And finally, let's go ahead and get the chart for the ILS Zulu approach runway 24 left. With all those charts selected, let's go ahead and start the preparation. So we're coming in from Lunik on the Lunik 3 Papa. Now, the standard arrival leads us all the way down to the south to Cap de Pera, then we fly back north onto the final approach. So let's go ahead and start checking this. Again, if you are a Navigraph subscriber, then you can use the data page, go onto the arrival airport, and over here it's going to suggest the charts for the procedure that you've entered on the arrival down here. Very useful stuff, but only available to Navigraph users. So let's select the Lunik 4 mic, let's go on route and legs page, and then we can compare what we've got in the legs page over here with the charted route. If you are not a Navigraph subscriber, well, then you can do this by, you know, looking there, looking there. You could even pull the FMS up over here, making it a little bit easier to get all of that on your screen at the same time. Alright, so we start from Lunik above level 100, and that's what we got. Then we proceed to the slew point, which is the SLP over here at 20 DME Captepera, and we can see we got D356 Tango. T is the 20th letter in the alphabet, therefore it stands for 20 DME, and 356, that's because this is the radial. So DME based, radial 356, and the Tango defined by the DME, 20th letter in the alphabet. So this is exactly the slew point we have defined on the arrival over here. Now, from there we're going to proceed southbound to Captepera, and we got that down here. Minimum holding altitude 4,500, and look at that, we have a 4,500 constraint as well. Then let's move on to our ILS Zulu approach, runway 24 left. So that one leaves Captepera, bound for the waypoint Bavoum, and you can see we've got Captepera to Bavoum, and Bavoum, 4,500 feet, is in there. Then we are turning towards the final, towards Ubumu, and we got Ubumu, and if you look at the vertical management here, we can see Ubumu is at or above 2,500, and then at the Fox India 24 left, at 7.5 dm from the ILS, which is the Fox India we got over here, we are going to intercept our glide slope. That thing is a 3-degree slope, which we can cross-check over here. Now we're going to fly that all the way down to the minimum. We're in a Cat Charlie aircraft, so that's 239 feet. So let's go ahead and dial up the minimum. We do this on the panel up here. You go to the Tune menu, PFD nav, minimum. Now you can dial it up. Now, the thing only takes steps of 10s, so if we have a look at the Lido chart, you will notice Lido is always giving you steps of 10s and not steps of 1s, so let's go ahead and load that one, and over here we can see our minimum is 240 feet. So let's dial up 240. When you're done, just hit Tune menu again to get out of the menu. So pretty easy. Now you will notice that this automatically sets up on both sides over here, and that's that. Now let's go ahead and have a look at the missed approach. So that's straight at maximum 185 knots. And then when we look at the textual description, climb and runway heading to 420. That's the 420 point you got here. Then turn left, not before radial 193 from Juliet Oscar Alpha. So that's why we got an intercept point over here. And follow radial 193, climb to 3000, contact ATC. And we can see we got, well, 195 down here, climbing to 3000. Now, small difference, probably because of a different magnetic variation database in the airplane. That's fine. Alright, and with that we have cross-checked our legs page. Now, some airlines do like their pilots to insert the MSA using the fixed pages, so you could do that going onto fixed down here. Then you could put Juliet Oscar Alpha, you could put a 25-mile ring around that, and like that you would get a visualization of the minimum safe altitude down here. You could also add all those radials over here using the radial crossing functions. Just be aware you can only enter one single thing per fixed page, so you might have to go down onto the further fixed pages down here in order to be able to enter all those radials. Just something you can do, you don't have to do it, but nice to know that it exists. Alright, with that we have checked our lateral flight plan, so let's now go to the vertical flight plan, and that means the descent tile of the FMS. And for that we need to talk a little bit about how VNAV works on the A220. So basically Bombardier built a fantastic airplane, they had a deadline to meet and an airplane to get out, but they didn't have a proper VNAV. So what they did is to insert a very simple system. Down here you define the glide slope, or rather, the angle at which your airplane is going to descend. You can only define one single angle for all altitudes. That is not a very sophisticated system. So what's going to happen instead is that your airplane is going to simply follow that 3-degree slope. Now, if you paid attention in basic aerodynamics, you will know that an airplane is going to be able to descend at a much steeper path at high altitudes when following a constant Mach number than it would be at low altitudes flying a low indicated airspeed. Therefore, expert pilots might define a little different path over here, overfly the topper descent, and then just descend in level change mode at a steeper angle to keep the engines in idle thrust for longer. That's something you can do, but let's keep it simple and let's have a look at how the VNAV system works properly for the purpose of today's flight. So, how is it intended to be used by the manufacturer? First of all, we're going to fill out the transition level. So, for that, we're going to have a look at the weather. QNH is 1017. And the transition altitude on the chart is 6,000. So with that, the transition level is going to be 7,000. So let's put that down in here. 7,000. Thank you. We verify the speed for the descent, and 0.78275 is the default speed option. So that's very good. Let's go ahead and take that. Next, we got our speed to altitude limit. So 250 below 100. Looks good. Happy to take that. Now, let's talk about the descent angle. So 3 degrees is the standard angle, and at 3 degrees the plane is approximately able to maintain its speed with idle thrust below level 100. Now, if you want to give yourself some options, you may just want to change this, for example, to 2.5 degrees. Have a look at what's going to happen when we do this. So let's type 2.5 in here. Now look at what happens to the topper descent. You can see this moves ahead, because now the entire path is calculated with a 2.5 degree angle. We can cancel that modification right now, but it's something you can do in this airplane, and using 2.5 degrees is going to give you a little more options when you get down to lower altitudes. So, something to consider. Obviously, 2.5 degrees will use more fuel because the engines are not going to be running in idle for pretty much the entire descent, so you are going to consume some more fuel. Just something to keep in mind there. Finally, let's move on to the approach tile. Over here, we are going to start by entering our destination weather. So, for that, Palma de Mallorca, 220 at 4, 28 degrees, 1017. So let's go up here, 220 at 4, 28 degrees, 1017. If the altitude over here shows something very excessive, that means you've most likely entered an incorrect QNH. The airplane's automatically calculating the pressure altitude here, depending on the QNH that you enter. So pay good attention to that altitude, and don't be surprised if this is different than the standard airfield elevation. That's totally normal. Next up, we got the flap setting. You can either use flaps 4 or flaps 5. 4 saves a little bit of fuel, so that's kind of the standard setting that you would see used under most circumstances. Now, pilots are going to determine the landing flap setting based on the conditions that you would expect at the landing. So you would look at things like your landing runway, want to know, okay, how many meters do I have to the exit? I basically want to break the airplane in order to achieve the most possible, or the least possible time on the runway. So that's what you're aiming for. Now, how are you going to do that? Well, you basically punch the numbers into the landing performance calculator, make sure to enter your landing weight, which you can get from down here, so that's 51.5 tons today, so let's go 51.5. Then you enter the flap settings, you enter the V-pilot, that's normally a minimum of 5 knots, up to a maximum of 10 for strong gusts. Then landing technique manual, medium auto brake, reverse a yes, then you just hit calculate. I'm using pre-release version, this is a little bugged right now, but that way you calculate the landing distance that you actually need, you compare that to the chart, and that basically gives you the numbers you need. For most flights, you will find yourself using auto brake medium. Remember, the auto brake in the 220 is quite different from the auto brake, for example, in the 320. Medium is the most used setting, low is very, very weak, and high, well, is high. Alright. So, last but not least, enter the VREF edition down here. Again, 5 knots for most cases, up to 10, basically half the gust value, but up to 10 as a maximum. When you're done, click Set V Speeds, and with that, our speeds are now transferred to our primary flight display, and that basically concludes the approach setup we have to do in the A220. Now, we are of course going to do an arrival briefing and all that lovely stuff, but that basically finishes our descent preparation tutorial. Note, do not try to set or to preset a QNH. That doesn't work. You would change the altimeter setting immediately. Welcome to the lovely world of the Airbus A220. Okay, and that concludes our cruise portion of this tutorial. So let's go ahead and talk about the descent part of our flight. Now, we are slowly closing in on our topper descent, and a minute prior to the topper descent, just now, the airplane plays an oral alert. You can see this basically starts triggering the descent logic from VNAV. So let's assume that we've gotten our descent clearance all the way down to 10,000, respectively level 100. You can see VNAV alt is active because we're still maintaining the level. VNAV path is armed. With that, once the VNAV path comes in over here, the airplane is going to transition into VNAV path mode and automatically going to start the descent. So that's going to happen right at the top of descent. Now let's have a look at that. And here we go. VNAV path now became active, and VNAV alt has armed. Alt basically is altitude select, so the plane is going to level off there. Now let's go ahead, set the altitude a little bit further down, and just have a look at what happens now. Now you can see this changes to V alt V. That's because now we do have the level 100 constraint, overhead Lunic over here, and the airplane would level off at that level 100 constraint. That's why you see Alt V, because the VNAV constraint is now more limiting than the altitude we have dialed up manually. Again, if we do put that at the same or higher, then it's going to show Alt S, so Alt Select. That way, the airplane tells you exactly what it's going to do and what it expects could happen under the current circumstances. Now, we've entered a 3-degree descent slope on the descent page. 3 degrees is very easy to calculate. So, we have ground speed 465 knots. At those 465 knots, we take the ground speed times 5, and that gives us our rate of descent. If you want to ease that, you can just divide it by half as well, by the way. So you have 465 divided by 2, 2,300. So in order to maintain that 3-degree path, we should see a vertical speed that's roughly in the ballpark of 2,300. And as you can see, that's exactly what the airplane is giving us. Now, as we're descending, and as we could possibly encounter icing conditions once again, remember to put the wing anti-ice back into auto. Now, with that, automatic anti-icing is provided once again, and just as a little reminder over here, where we do say that in the climb, -40 is the limit, in the descent we treat it differently. And in the descent we actually say, okay, whenever you do encounter visible moisture, that may be reason enough to select the anti-ice. Just something to have in mind there, because, you know, you're flying an airplane, and you ideally want to survive flying an airplane. Alright, enough of that little excursion over here. Let's go ahead and talk about a couple more things in the descent. So, the airplane features a high altitude speed protection during the descent. You might have seen that when we initially initiated the descent, the speed increased quite a bit. You are following a simple set slope. If you set this to 4 degrees or 5 degrees, the plane is going to do it. But it is not going to be able to maintain the speed. So what you are doing over here, and this is quite different from both other Airbuses, as well as pretty much any Boeing aircraft I know. The speed and the vertical path are independent from one another. In other words, you can see that our engines are in idle, speed is increasing here. The speed may go all the way into the overspeed. The airplane is bluntly going to follow the VNAV path all the way into the overspeed. But during descents at or near VMO or MMO, most overspeeds are encountered after the autopilot initiates capture of the VNAV path from above, or during a level off where the spoilers were required to maintain the path. In these cases, if the spoilers are retracted during the level off, the aircraft can momentarily overspeed. During descents, using spoilers near VMO and MMO, delay the retraction of the spoilers until after VNAV path or altitude capture is complete. Crews routinely climbing or descending in windier conditions may consider a 5 to 10 knot reduction in the climb or descent speed to reduce overspeed occurrences. This will have a minimal effect on fuel consumption and total trip time, but greatly increases the safety margins. Now, when encountering an inadvertent overspeed conditions, crews should leave the autopilot engaged unless it is apparent that the autopilot is not correcting the overspeeds. However, if manual inputs are required, disengage the autopilot. Be aware that disengaging the autopilot to avoid or reduce the severity of an inadvertent overspeed may result in an abrupt pitch change. During climb or descent, if VNAV or level change pitch control is not correcting the overspeed satisfactorily, switch to vertical speed mode temporarily, which may help in controlling the indicated airspeed. So remember, VNAV always gives you the VNAV path that the airplane is bluntly following, but if the speed increases towards an overspeed, temporarily change it to vertical speed and manually reducing that vertical speed could potentially provide you quite some savings there in terms of the paperwork that you might have to do when you encounter an actual overspeed. Alright, as soon as the speed is below VMO or MMO, VNAV or flight level change may be reselected, and note at any time that VMO or MMO is exceeded, the maximum airspeed shall be noted in the work order for the tach log. Because yeah, that's what engineers absolutely love. Alright, so that much about the entire descent logic and how VNAV works over here. Remember, it bluntly follows that path that you've defined down here. If the speed run the way, happens. Only if you go into an overspeed, that's when it reverts to flight level change and starts reducing the speed. If that is not done to a satisfactory manner, just go vertical speed. Note that you can at any time use the spoilers if that becomes required. Now, let's take a moment and talk about those spoilers, because they're a little special on the A220. You can see you basically got retracted, 1/4, half, 3/4, full, and then you got max. Now, in the real airplane, when you pull the spoiler axis down, it goes all the way to full, and it doesn't go any further unless you actually lift the entire lever up, and then you can lift it across a gate and put it into max. Do not use max on the spoilers under normal conditions, because damage to the components of the spoilers can actually occur. So, a little careful there, because the Synaptic A220 does unfortunately, in the version that I got, which is a pre-release, does not feature that protection. If you look at this, you can simply pull the spoilers into max, it's just gonna do it. You will also see that indicated on the ICAS over here. So when they're in the normal range, it's just going to show spoilers out. When you go past that range, it is going to show spoilers max. So when you have to use the spoilers, just be careful not to accidentally pull the spoilers into a position where damage can potentially occur to the airplane. Just something to keep in mind there. Now, let's talk about the autopilot modes that are available in the Descent. So I've already shown VNAV path mode off, which is what we're using now. I've also shown the difference between V-Alt-S and V-Alt-V. If it goes to V-Alt-V, it's going to target the constraint coming from the flight plan. If it's in V-Alt-S, it's going to target whatever you've selected manually. Now, there are two other modes available that you can use in, well, three other modes that you can use in the Descent. First of all, you can simply go to level change. When you go to level change and you deselect VNAV, then the airplane is simply bluntly going to target the speed, go to idle thrust, and then follow whatever may be appropriate there. You can also combine level change with VNAV. What's happening now under these conditions is that level change is the active mode. The plane is going to follow the target speed, and now you got VNAV path armed. This is a good mode to use when you're above the profile and need to fly the airplane down into the target profile, because as you can see, when you reach the target profile, VNAV path simply re-engages. Now if you are above the profile and need to get yourself down, what you can do is simply to go manual speed over here and increase the target speed with VNAV path armed, and then once you reach the target, the plane is going to recapture the VNAV profile. Then you can, for example, reselect FMS speed, and then it's going to target the FMS speed again as well. Now while we're descending, there's a couple of things we got to be careful about. As you can see, we're just reaching the slew point of the arrival over here. The target speed has reduced towards 250, but the plane is making no effort at all to reduce its speed. That's because we are still targeting the 3 degrees. In other words, in order to reduce that airspeed, you have no choice but to go for the spoilers. Yeah, that's how dumb the VNAV system on the 220 is. You got that super modern airliner that has an incredible set of avionics, but when it comes to the VNAV descent, that's how dumb it is. So here we go, speed is coming down back to 250. Let's go ahead and retract those spoilers again. And here we are down at 250. As mentioned, it's a super dumb airplane in terms of the VNAV system. Now, as we are descending through 15,000, that is normally my latest point where I would recommend to turn on the fasten seatbelt sign. Let's just take a moment to talk about different rules that airlines may use for the fasten seatbelt sign. So, in short-haul operations like what we're doing on the 220 over here, the recommendation is normally to turn the fasten seatbelt sign on when you're either 15 minutes from landing or when you are at 15,000 feet, whichever comes earlier. Now, we just took the 15,000 feet over here, and this is also a good moment to start tidying the cockpit up. So let's remove those sunshades over here. Put the sunglasses back on. Our FO has already done it. Lovely. And here we go. Now we got a nicely cleaned up airplane that we can prepare for the arrival. Now let's take a little moment to continue talking about what our airplane is going to do. In order to reduce from 250 to 210, from where you would normally commence flap extension, the plane needs about 15 nautical miles on a 3-degree descent. That is the theory. The practice is that it is rather not going to reduce the speed at all, so just pay some attention to the target speed, use the spoilers as necessary in order to help the speed reduction. Now, let's talk altimeter settings. When you're descending, you are going to keep the altimeter on standard as long as the target is a flight level. So today we got a transition level at 70, ATC has cleared us to 80, so therefore we are going to keep the altimeter on standard setting. Let's ignore that, it's going to recapture the VNAV path in a moment. So when it enters a turn early, sometimes the path jumps off, but it's going to recapture that, no worries about that. So, when you're descending, then as soon as you're cleared to an altitude, so let's go down to the 4,500 here. Remember, steps of 500, push the button in. as soon as you're cleared for that, we are also going to set the QNH. So the altimeter setting today is 1017. So let's go ahead. We are now cleared to 4500. So let's set the altimeter to 1017. Like that. So in cases where the VNAV path does jump off, the airplane reverts on a flight path angle mode. Remember, you're flying a 3-degree path, so if you want to capture that, hey, just go to a 4-degree angle. Now the airplane's flying right back into the descent path. We do have a deceleration point down there, but the airplane's not going to level off, as you can see on the vertical profile. Instead, you are simply going to capture, you are simply going to reduce the speed target. So, again, manual management may be necessary, so let's use the spoilers over here to keep the speed under control. Now we're heading towards the center line and to the final approach, so let's take a moment to talk about the approach logic in the Airbus A220. And you can see VNAV is recapturing over there, diving for the path, but it's going to capture it fine. Okay, so let's take a moment to talk about the entire approach sequence and the approach logic. First of all, we do have a checklist for that. So let's go ahead and get that out and do the descent and approach checks. So that's FMS Set. For that, we verify that we've done all the entries we needed. Minima set. So that's up here, 240. So let's go ahead and verify that. 240 is in. Auto brake as required. We're going to use medium. ICAS checked. For that, we're checking for any message that may be relevant for our flight here. And then we got arrival briefing complete, and we have done that. And that's the descent and approach checklist complete. Next is going to be the before landing checklist. So there is nothing further on our way down. Now, reaching the decel point, the speed target is going to go down to the F1 speed. Now let's have a look into the different speeds we got. We got a green dot, F1, F2, F3, F4. Basically, when you're reaching those speeds, make sure that you do this setting. So, reaching F1, we are going to select flaps 2, or rather we are going to select flaps 1, and then the speed target is going to reduce to the F2 speed. That way, the speed is easily going to reduce. We've just overflown the decel point. You can see this is now happening, but make sure to help the airplane with the deceleration if it's not happening by itself. So, full spoilers. And down we go. Alright, so let's talk about capturing the ILS. Now, we can see that the ILS arms automatically, and once we're cleared for the approach, we simply press the approach button, and then you will see that when the localizer comes in, the airplane is simply going to capture that. That's as easy as it is. Here it is. It just transitioned automatically, and it's capturing the localizer. That only works when you're actually flying under FMS navigation. When you are flying under radar vectors, you have to use the nav bearing switch or the nav source switch to manually select the localizer up there in order for the airplane to be able to fly that. Alright, so we're reaching the F1 speed. Let's go ahead and select flaps 1. And you can see now the speed target goes down to the next speed. One small thing where the 220 can be a little itchy is that the plane is not certified to go onto V-approach in FMS mode. So we need to select that manually. 131 plus 5, 136. Now, let's go ahead and select that down. And do note that you may not be able to select it until the flaps are extended, because it will never let you decelerate below a certain speed. Alright, so we're at the F1 speed. Let's select flaps 2. And now you can see the plane goes down to the F3 speed for the flap 3 selection. So that's pretty much how it works. Fairly easy system. Now let's go ahead and talk about the approach configuration and the landing. Typical approach scenario over here. We are approaching in flaps 2. Speed is decelerating towards the F3 speed. And that is our typical approach setup. Now you can see that the airplane does not track the localizer very accurately outside 12 nautical miles. And that is actually a quirk of the real-world airplane that Synaptic has simulated. For this reason, A220 pilots love to do RNAV approaches over ILS approaches. But I know that flight simmers love their ILS. That's the reason why I'm using the ILS for the purpose of this video. Now, this is our standard sequence that we're arriving in over here. Flaps 2 at the F3 speed, or if you need to fly any ATC sign speed, you just go manual over here and then fly that speed. And that is how this is done. Now, 6 miles from the runway, we're going to go gear down flaps 3, and then configure the airplane completely. Now, just like we had that climb sequence, we also have a landing sequence. So basically, you go call gear down landing sequence, then the first officer is all by himself without additional commands going to select the flaps to the landing setting when you reach the appropriate speeds and do the landing checklist. Beautiful, isn't it? Just that we don't have a first officer here in the simulator, so we kind of still have to do that on our own. Alright. So let's go ahead and get into that sequence. So we're 8 miles out. I am going to start configuring a little earlier. Normally you do this at 6 miles. It's just for the purpose of the video that I do it at 8. Because we need to talk a little bit about the landing later on. So, landing sequence. We go gear down flaps 3. You can see the speed target automatically comes down to the F4 speed. And then when we're reaching the F4 speed, we're going to go flaps 4. Like this. Then we do the before landing checklist. That's altimeters, QNH 1017 checked. And as you can see, inside 8 miles, the plane is now capturing the localizer a little bit more accurately. So, altimeter 1017 set and cost checked. Flaps 4, cabin ready, before landing checklist complete. And that's as easy as it is. So remember, for VRAF we need to switch over to manual speed control and set the VRAF. And with that we have basically completed everything. You can see the plane captures and tracks the localizer a lot more accurately at these speeds over here, which is something that I do really appreciate. Now let's talk about the landing. So, a manual landing in the A220. You come in at about 4 degrees pitch. You come in at VRF plus 5. At 30 feet you go to idle thrust and you initiate the flare, and don't do this later than 30, otherwise chances are you're not going to be able to break the descent rate and do a positive landing. The flapper wire has an automatic nose down moment once your main gears touch down. Therefore the plane has a pretty strong tendency to lower the nose. We are going to have to counter that by not releasing the stick the moment we touch down. Keep the stick, only release it very gradually to manually control that nose down towards the ground. Alright, let's go ahead and have a look at how that's done in practice. We are going to disconnect the autopilot, we are going to disconnect the auto throttle, like this.
Approaching 24 left.
That's checked. Alright, now let's keep the airplane on the puppies, let's keep it on the centerline, let's keep it on the approach speed. Remember, you have to trim this aircraft, and you want it to be in trim latest at 200 feet. Okay, so aim to be on speed, very small corrections on the thrust only. About 46% is where the engines really start to develop great changes in thrust, so very small changes here. Keep the nose steady, do not constantly pitch up and down in an attempt to chase the glide. Much rather, aim to keep the complete flight path steady over here. Like this. So at 30, idle and flare. And keep the nose. Here we are. Touchdown, select reverse. Idle reverse for noise abatement if the airport demands it. Otherwise, can always use up to maximum if required for safety reasons. 70 knots, let's make sure we go down to idle reverse and then brake to vacate yourself onto the exit. make sure you stow the reversers by the time that you reach normal taxi thrust settings. Once the runway is vacated, reset the chrono and restart it, because after 5 minutes we can shut an engine down in order to conserve a little bit of fuel. But more on that for the after landing procedures. So we're now vacating the runway and we can start with the after landings the moment that the airplane is entirely off the runway. So make sure that you taxi that entire airplane beyond the whole throttle line. Not just the flight deck, but the entire airplane. That includes the tail and the APU. Alright, so we're now getting off the runway and now we can clean the airplane up. Now, this is fairly easy. If you look into the checklist, you'll see that the after landing checklist is just the flaps. So, let's bring those flaps in. Like this. But there is a bit more than that. You also have to switch the strobe lights off. You gotta turn the landing lights as needed. Should have been on at 10,000 feet. And at this moment you should have turned them back off again. I forgot them. Shame on me. That's fine. Alright, so that means after landing flow, flaps retract and set your lights. And that's it. Alright. Now once again, if you zoom all the way in, you should get the airport map. If you go to data, you can get quick access, for example, to the airport chart down here. Pretty useful stuff that you have down here that you can use. And that's that. Now, let's quickly talk about single engine taxi. Now, once 5 minutes after high thrust operations are elapsed, you can shut down engine number 1, and only number 1, not number 2. Only number 1. Shut that thing down. The airplane should have sufficient thrust available to continue taxiing nicely. If you are doing tight turns, some small thrust increments may be required on engine number 2 in order to keep it rolling, but do not go above 40% N1 on the remaining engine. When you're approaching your gate, you can start the APU, and the challenge among short-haul pilots is always to time the APU start so that you get the APU running the exact moment that you arrive on block and set your parking brakes. That's something that we always aim for, you know, as little APU usage as possible, and sometimes it works better, sometimes it works worse. Alright, so let's just go ahead and select ground services over here. We do want gate number 44, no follow me, and handling by escort. Alright, approaching the gate, we are going to turn the taxi light off and also make sure that the weather radar is switched off. Then take it nice and slow, you know, 5 knots maximum turning into the gate. No need to rush this. Better safe than sorry. So, we're about to enter the gate over here. A little bit of oversteering. Again, you're operating in a very congested area here with the gates. Nice and slow. So, the APU is now available, but when you're still taxiing with the APU available, be sure to put that APU bleed off. Otherwise, you are going to ingest the exhaust of your engine. Flight simmers would say it smells nice. Your typical passenger is going to say, what the hell is happening? Alright, finally, let's go ahead and park that airplane. GSX doesn't really get the centerline right for the 220. That's okay with me. And I am not going to care about that 1 feet. So, once you're there, parking brake set, and then again, let's go into the ECL. So, shutdown checklist. No steer off. APU or external power, we're on APU, and then right engine run off. Off, slides disarmed, seatbelts off, and beacon off. And once the engines are shut down, you can also turn that APU bleed back on in order to get your air conditioning going. Now, you can see that point on the checklist down here, flight control test required. Now, there are situations under which you may get an ICAS message telling you that a flight control test is required. If it is, select yes and simply do what's commanded on the checklist. The flight control test button is found on the Synaptic avionics page. Down here, flight controls. But today we do not get that message, so we are going to select no, and with that the shutdown checklist is complete. So at this point we would eventually get our deboarding, so let's just request that. We would get our chocks, we would get our ground power unit. Now, the parking brake is supposed to stay set throughout the entire turnaround. Do not rely on the chocks on the 220, just keep the parking brake. When external power is available, we can connect it and shut that APU down. And that's basically all there is to this. So, we made it on block. Our passengers are out. Let's go ahead and do the power off procedure. So, again, this is giving you complete guidance. So, ECL on DU2, that's because once we turn the electric power off, we are going to lose the display on the right here. Let's go checklist over here. So ECL is on DU2. The rest, except for the external power, are all sentenced items. So you simply look at them and then you do them. So equipment cooling inlet, that's up here, off. Now that one is unfortunately currently not modeled, so we basically got to ignore this for now. Then emergency lights off. Hydraulic 3A, 3B and 2B pumps off. And then APU is already off, so external power avail. Now what does that mean? You can see in use is what you get when it is in use. When you deactivate it, that's when it turns to avail. That's the reason it says that down here. So dome light off. Remember, we've been running this from our departure, and then batteries off. But only turn those off after the APU has had a minute to cool down. You can check that on the Synaptic page, and you can see the APU takes a long time to shut down over here. You basically want to wait until that door shows closed and the RPM reach 0 in order to turn the batteries off. So, for the purpose of the video, we'll imagine that that has already happened. So then you turn the batteries off, airplane goes cold and dark, and that's all there is to this. So guys, that is a full flight from cold and dark to cold and dark in the Synaptic Airbus A220. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you liked the tutorial. Let me know how you liked it in the video comments down below. If you really love what I'm doing on this channel, then do leave a comment below and tell me about it. And if you want to support me, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you very much for watching. As always, like, comment and subscribe. And if you really love what I'm doing on this channel, well, you've had that part, you've heard that part. And finally, do leave your questions in the comments underneath the video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one.